dedicated to the memory of my mother, Myrna Onisha Giuliana, to my father, Joseph Robert Giuliana, to His Divine Grace B.H. Mangal Niloy Goswami Maharaj, and to my first literary agent, Michael Powers. Leaves on a tree, green to brown, bud to ground, a life fulfilled. Robert Noel Giuliano. Om Tat Sat. The man who hath no music in himself, nor is moved with the concord of sweet sounds, let no such man be trusted. William Shakespeare. Preface. Down the Rabbit Hole. It's what you think you know about George Harrison that can fool you. Dedicated students of Beatle lore might well be able to rattle off chapter and verse of the enigmatic guitar player's most obscure recording work, or the more philosophically inclined details of his famous flirtation with Indian mysticism. Ex-lovers, caterwaulings, family squabbles, Beatle battles, and stories of his druggy days piled up end to end might well stretch around something or other, but the real man always seems to elude us. Slipping away quicksilver fast afloat on a sea of eternal publicity, Harrison has thus far always had the last laugh. A quarter of a century later, all of the many media pundits and pop soothsayers intent on bringing him in alive are still no closer to the mark. Old George, I'm happy to report, is just too clever for them. 25 years on a treadmill like the Beatles' ever-whirling helter-skelter will do that to you. Harrison's Trojan horse approach to public adulation is not only extremely effective, but for the tight-lipped superstar undeniably essential. Look what happened to Lennon, one might be tempted to argue in defense of George's well-known lust for privacy. John was all over the streets of Manhattan for almost 5 years, an easy target for the Beatle-obsessed. One look at the barbed wire and brick fortress George calls home, however, should tell anyone he plans to live a very, very long time. A wilting Prince Prospero on the run from Poe's ever-advancing Red Death. As for me, my initiation into the Beatles' magic circle way back in the burly winter of 1964 was to herald the beginning of my own inner voyage. It's not that the Beatles presented any great answers, but over the course of the last 25 years they have helped to solidify a number of very important questions. George Harrison, particularly, through his rather astounding body of work, has contributed a great deal of insight into the amazing journey that is life. It is wrong, however, to think of Harrison as any sort of leader. Rather, he is more of a fellow traveler. He would be the first to admit that as a spiritual seeker he is a rank amateur, a mystical punk with his head and heart in the heavens, but his feet still firmly on the ground. Pete Townsend wrote me a letter years ago in which he said that to his mind, punks were especially close to God. If that's so, then perhaps George Harrison is closer to his ultimate goal than he thinks. Maybe we all are. I don't mind people telling my story, Harrison explained to me a few years back. It's just that they never seem to get it right. To be honest, I've rather given up hope than anyone ever will. Seeing him sitting there in his old pal Legs Larry Smith's tiny bedstead in rural Oxfordshire, I remember thinking that I would never, ever want to trade places with this man. It was clear to me that his much-heralded jet-set lifestyle no longer held any attraction for him, and that despite all the untold wealth and privilege, his soul was almost now completely barren. Long ago picked clean by the unrelenting backlash of die-hard Beatlemania, and a world that the cynical Harrison continually refers to simply as loony. Picking up the gauntlet of George's left-handed challenge to write a really good book about his topsy-turvy days as the Beatles' amazing rhythm ace was no small task, believe me. And it was only after much soul-searching of my own that I ever dared to consider taking up the cause. I am, after all, mostly just a dedicated observer, one of the many from my generation who looked upon the Beatles as the psychedelic Pied Pipers of a new order, an order I hope based on more meaningful values than those of our parents. The reality, of course, turned out to be something quite different. From where I sit now, it looks to me like one generation is basically just as good or bad as the other. It's apparently only the ad hoc circumstances of one's own karma that tend to tilt the scales. And so it is with our Mr. Harrison. As George's long-dead invisible mentor and founder of Friar Park, Sir Frank Crisp, inscribed over the stone portals of the great manor, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, but let his foibles pass. Life is one long enigma, true, my friend. So read on, read on. The answer's at the end." Geoffrey Giuliano, Skyfield, Western New York, September 1989. Chapter 1. Blue Moon over Wavertree, Childhood. George himself is no mystery, but the mystery inside of George is immense. It's watching him uncover it all little by little that's so damn interesting. John Lennon, 1968. "Every once in a while I used to see George in town for a drink," says Nigel, the lanky ex-roadie for the 70s supergroup Uriah Heep, during a chance encounter in 1983. Of course, he's always so low-key that even many of the regulars never really caught on to who he was. I remember one old jit rabbiting on and on about how the famous George Harrison of the Beatles lived in Henley, and was even known to come into that very pub for a lager from time to time. "No," said George, full of mock surprise and more than a little thick Newcastle brown, "not him." On Harrison's home turf of the pastoral Oxfordshire river town, Henley-on-Thames, one is tempted to believe just about anything one hears concerning the lauded guitar player, if only by virtue of the fact that even those with an ear for such Beatle-related gossip hear so very, very little at all. Even Henley's few crusty cabbies will tell you that although they're summoned to pick up a fare at Friar Park, or the Park as the locals call Harrison's palatial Victorian manor, they're never sure which of the several soiled groundskeepers marauding around the garden is actually who he seems. More than once I've seen him digging around out there up to the tops of his wellies in shit, cooed one chain-smoking driver while taking me on a 10-pence tour of Henley. He's an odd one, is George. But then they all were, weren't they? So very discreet are the many Harrison insiders in Henley about the goings-on at George's that even the Standard, the tiny township's daily paper, has managed a few quick snaps of the reclusive Beatle in all the 20-odd years that he's been in residence. Even those rare birds who somehow manage to summon up the courage to amble cautiously up to the park's massive wrought-iron gates and take a poke at the estate's brass intercom button are almost always made to feel most unwelcome. "Fuck off," ordered a voice from inside to one such ballsy reporter from nearby Radio Reading following John Lennon's tragic assassination in December of 1980. And as if that wasn't enough to discourage intruders intent upon an afternoon of up-close Beatle-watching, then the elegant green and gold sign posted just outside the main gate advising all uninvited guests to "get your ass out of here," in 10 major languages, just might. Despite the bravado, however, and although he has recently installed an elaborate security system, Harrison steadfastly refuses to allow any guard dogs on his property. As Ian Pace of Deep Purple told me, to George, dog is God spelled backwards, negative symbolism bound to be offensive to the religiously conservative Harrison. Forever the odd man out as a member of the celebrated Fab Four, George has often referred to himself and Ringo as economy-class Beatles, and on a purely financial level, John and Paul having both received a larger share of royalties from the sale of their albums, that may indeed be true. However, both as an artist and a time-tested, sincere truth-seeker, Harrison is running way ahead of the game. About the name of his fledgling record label, Dark Horse, he once said, "That's the one who suddenly pulls out from behind the rest and barrels ahead to actually win the race. The one that nobody's bothered to put any money on. That's me, I guess. The very last one anyone would have ever expected to come out a winner." George's father, Harold Hargreaves Harrison, first met his mother, Louise French, on a Liverpool street corner in 1929. On shore leave from his job as a steward with the famous White Star Line, he and several of his shipmates were looking about one afternoon when they happened upon Louise and a couple of her friends out for a stroll. "I'm going off to Africa in the morning," one of the boys shouted to the giggly young girls. "Give us your address, and I'll send you each a bottle of scent." Louise, a shop girl at a suburban greengrocer's, dutifully scrawled out her home number on the back of a cigarette packet. Harry, never one to shy away from a potential conquest, immediately grabbed it out of her hand. "Thanks very much, Ducky," he said. "I'll write you as soon as we're out to sea." A few weeks later, the postman rang the bell of the French's neat little row house and handed Louise's mother a crisp white envelope bearing the striking insignia of the posh commercial shipping line. Mrs. French had just allowed an old man who'd been struggling down the road to the kitchen to fetch himself a drink of water. Curious about the smart, official-looking letter lying there on the table, he casually peeled back the flaps and read aloud Harry's long, soppy love note to the embarrassed teenager. The letters continued to come, all from increasingly exotic ports of call, as the adventurous Master Harrison catered and waited his way around the world. Born in Liverpool on May 28, 1909, Harry, the son of journeyman bricklayer Henry Harrison and Janet Thompson, left school at 14 to work as a delivery boy, earning just 7 shillings a week. Skimpy as it was, the money helped out, as his father had been killed at Mons during World War I, and his mother was left alone with several children to care for. By the age of 17, Harry, like so many other young men from the rough-and-ready Liverpool port, was already at sea. Even after he and Louise were married on May 20th, 1930, he remained a sailor, coming ashore about 6 years later only to wind up on the dole for the next 15 months. During a quick backstage interview in 1974, the elder Harry spoke about those years. Life at sea was rough, all right. Every week, without fail, I always sent home my pay to Louise. As a first-class steward, I used to take in some pretty good tips as well, so I would try and live off that. I was saving to try and come ashore. The problem was, by the time I finally got round to making it in, there was a terrible depression going on, so I ended up collecting just over 25 bob a week. We got by well enough, but life was never easy. Despite the hard times, the Harrisons were a warm and loving family. Still, working at the grocer's right up until a few weeks before their first child, Louise, was born in 1931, Mrs. Harrison always tried to remain optimistic. "Lord willing, we'll be all right," George remembers her saying when he was a child. It could always be worse. By 1934, the Harrisons' second child, Harry, was born. Years later, as Friar Park's devoted estate manager, he would remember those early years as wonderful. Our little house was just 2 rooms up and 2 down, but except for a short period when our father was away at sea, we always knew the comfort and security of a very close-knit family life. Intent upon finding an occupation which might afford his growing family the things they needed, Harry eventually found work as a bus conductor, and after just a year was promoted to driver. In an interview conducted in late 1987, Paul McCartney remembered George Harrison's parents this way. "Harry was our local bus driver who was always great fun, but forthright and very straightforward as well. He would run over a dog in his bus rather than try and swerve a little to avoid it, and quite rightly, too. I suppose he was responsible for a lot of people's lives, but I remember always being a little bit disturbed about that hardness in his character. Now, Louise was lovely, though quite a hard lady, too, in many ways, but soft as a toffee on the inside, really. I remember her pouring a pan of water on some fellow she didn't want to open the door to. She'd always tell you how she felt, Louise." Peter, the sibling George was always closest to as a youngster, was born on July 20, 1940, the same year as John Lennon. All in all, it was a terribly tense time in Liverpool, as World War II was now in full swing and Hitler's Luftwaffe was making nightly bombing raids over the city. In those days, everything was in short supply, recalled George's father. Sugar, butter, tea, meat, even clothes were all strictly rationed. As far as fresh fruits and vegetables were concerned, you could just forget it. Every once in a while, though, one of my passengers would tip me with an apple, or even an unheard-of banana. With the upcoming summer of 1942, Louise discovered she was once again pregnant, a prospect that put an even greater strain on the family's limited resources. This is not to say that the baby was unwanted or unloved, but simply unexpected. It would be the couple's last child. George Harrison was born at 12:10 a.m., February 25, 1943. In George's autobiography, I, Me, Mine, the philosophically minded Beatle endeavored to put a finger on the metaphysics involved in this, his latest incarnation. To try and imagine the soul entering the womb of a mother living at 12 Arnold Grove, Wavertree, Liverpool, 15. There were all the barrage balloons and the Germans bombing Liverpool. All of that was going on. I sat outside the house a couple of years ago. Imagining 1943, nipping through the spiritual world, the astral level, getting back into a body in that house. That really is strange when you consider the whole planet and all the planets there may be on the physical level. How do I come into that family, in that house, at that time? And who am I anyway? Mr. Harrison's impression of his little son, however, wasn't quite so lofty. I vaguely remember tiptoeing up the stairs to see him after he was born, he said. All I could think of was, he looked so remarkably like me, a tiny, squalling, miniature replica of myself. At his mother's insistence, baby George was baptized a Catholic like the other children, although the Harrisons were admittedly not overtly religious. George's mother recalls him as a toddler. George was very good as a child. He was no trouble at all and seldom misbehaved. Lots of people think maybe I say this now because he's famous, but he was good, so it would be unfair to say he was a naughty boy. George was very eager to start school. He was bright, intelligent, and extremely independent. He was also very fair-haired. He and his brother Pete were always together, and as a tot, George would often look at the photographs of his brother and think it was him. He never played about the streets as a child. He used to like swimming and always found something constructive to do with his spare time. George's first school was Dovedale Primary, just a short hop from his home, across Penny Lane and down the street. John Lennon was there already, 3 years ahead of the young George, and just beginning to dabble on the guitar. The two never met at school. In Hunter Davies' definitive The Beatles, an authorized biography, Louise Harrison remembers his son's early days at Dovedale. I took him to school that first day. He wanted to stay dinners right from the beginning. The next day I was getting my coat off the hanger, and he said, "Oh, no, I don't want you to take me." I asked, "Why not?" "I don't want you to be one of those nosy mothers standing round the gate talking." He's always been against that sort of thing. He used to hate all the neighbors who stood about gossiping. One of George's earliest memories is of going to an outdoor market with his brothers, Harry and Peter, to buy live chickens. Each of the boys brought home his own hen, but only Peter's survived. It was kept in a pen in the Harrisons' tiny back garden, but occasionally got free and scrambled around through the house. Harrison recalls that as the months passed, the hen grew to a monstrous size. A fellow was then hired to wring its neck, and the bird was then dressed and roasted for the Harrisons' Christmas dinner. The image of the hen, hanging on the clothesline to bleed dry, was never to leave the impressionable little boy. Years later, as a Beatle, George eagerly embraced vegetarianism for a time. Nowadays, our Christmas dinner doesn't depend on the death of one of the millions of poor innocent birds, George said late in 1988, and it tastes all the better knowing that no blood was spilt. The Harrisons' home on Arnold Grove was a cramped, run-down terrace house in Wavertree, a working-class section of Liverpool. George remembers some of the inadequacies of life there. The rooms downstairs were always extremely cold during the winter. We had only one fire in the entire house, and other than that, there was no heating at all, I remember. My brothers and I absolutely dreaded getting up in the morning, as it was bloody freezing. On top of that, the toilet was outside, next to my dad's little homemade hen house. In 1949, the Harrisons moved from Wavertree to a brand-new, roomy council house in nearby Speck, where Harry had applied some 18 years earlier. The property at 25 Upton Green was lovely in comparison with Arnold Grove, but Louise didn't take to the sort of rough-and-tumble people who lived in the area and longed for the cozy familiarity of the old neighborhood. Harry Harrison remembers his wife taking 8-year-old George to the cinema, and the boy insisting that she give an old tramp half a crown. Money didn't mean anything to him even then, says Harry. If George had his way, every old boy we saw should be entitled to at least a few pence. He was always very compassionate like that. Even today, Harrison hates to see homeless people hanging around in doorways or sleeping on the pavement. Once in the early 80s, as he was leaving a trendy London restaurant with his friends Legs Larry Smith and Rolling Stone Bill Wyman, he offhandedly presented a destitute old man with a crisp 50-pound note. According to Larry, it wasn't the first time he had seen the guitarist give so freely. Although money in those days was unusually tight, the Harrisons still tried to make a little family trip together at least once a year. Usually they went to nearby towns on the northwest coast. Birdston Hill, Southport, New Brighton, and the standard British holiday resort, Blackpool. In I Me Mine, George recalls several childhood visits to Wales, where he marveled at the country's natural beauty. We all went to Wales, staying in little places, nice old stone cottages with slate roofs. Probably cost next to nothing to rent. You could actually live a whole happy life in a place like that. On one holiday in Scotland, George was suddenly taken ill while swimming with his brothers in Inverness. A doctor was called, and George was ordered into the hospital. An ambulance arrived with 2 stretcher-bearers, but George was adamant. "I'm not going on that," he said bluntly, and walked out of the hotel with the stretcher-men in procession behind. In the hospital, George was far from a model patient. He hated the salt-free diet they put him on so much that he wrapped one meal in a brown paper bag and threw it out the window when no one was looking. Unfortunately for him, the matron just happened to be passing underneath at precisely that moment and caught the parcel right on her head. She strode purposely up the stairs and into George's ward, only to find him apparently fast asleep. "He was the first person I'd ever seen smiling that broadly in his sleep," she said dryly to his parents afterwards. Although George was certainly very intelligent and capable, he was never really fond of school. Bearing in mind George's outstanding creative achievements of later years, one might well assume that in the eyes of his masters anyway, the seemingly disinterested Harrison was a bit of an anomaly. "Little polite rows of toffee-headed robots," John Lennon once said. "That's all any of the teachers are after." Despite George's natural reservations about school, he was at first a good student. In an interview with Hunter Davies in 1967, he aired some of his views on the subject. "Although we sat for the entrance examination at grammar school, the teacher asked who thought they had passed. Only one boy put his hand up. He was a little fat lad who smelled. It was very sad, really. He turned out to be the only one who didn't pass. Smelly kids like that were the sort teachers made you sit next to as a punishment. So the poor smelly kids really got screwed up. All teachers are like that, and the more screwed up they are, the more they pass it on to the kids. They're all ignorant. I always thought that. Yet because they were old and withered, you were somehow supposed to believe they weren't." To George, seeing through the illusion of so-called adult authority seemed to be all the justification he needed to forever reject its dictates even at such an early age. Like so many others in the creative sphere, it was George himself who ultimately found the courage to reject the mores and values he saw around him. From those nosy mothers standing at the school gate to the unenlightened, interfering masters he met at school, George Harrison has never borne fools gladly. After leaving Quarrybank High School for Boys in 1953, George was enrolled in the Liverpool Institute. On his first day there, he was jumped from behind by a local roughneck, which did little to bolster his enthusiasm for his new school. At first, Harrison did try to make the best of things by attending classes and keeping up with his homework, but soon, as George put it, the old rot set in, and once again declared a war of inattention on all things relating to his life at school. As he told Davies in the Beatles, "I hated being dictated to. Some schizophrenic jerk just out of training college would read out notes to you which you were expected to take down. I couldn't read them afterwards anyway. They never fooled me. Useless, the lot of them. I had this mutual thing with a few masters. They let me sleep at the back of the class if I wouldn't cause any trouble. If it was nice and sunny, it was very hard to keep awake anyway, with some old fellow chundering away on. I used to wake up at 4:45 to find out they'd all gone home long ago." Hand in hand with the young teenager's rebellious attitude towards school was a sudden change in his appearance. Gone was the black laser-gray flannel trousers and matching school tie. From now on, his big brother Harry's wild canary-yellow waistcoat, secretly altered skin-tight pants, and blue suede winkle-pickers with their long pointed toes was the order of the day. George's sassy new individualized school uniform. Another distressing addition to Harrison's look, or so his teachers thought, was his slick-back hairstyle. Walking every morning to the bus stop with his school cap perched high atop his head, he looked every bit the gawky neighborhood hipster he fancied himself. Mr. Harrison was definitely not amused. To him, career success and ultimate financial stability hinged on a solid education, which in turn depended on the impression one made. Harry, after all, had come up the hard way, and he wanted better for his children. Of his 3 sons, only George had made it into grammar school, so naturally his father had high hopes for the boy. To most people of Harry's generation, conformity was the only acceptable way for a young man just starting out. "Don't rock the boat, sonny," he used to tell the rebellious and determined teen. "If you're not careful, you just might drown." His mother Louise, on the other hand, found George's mildly outrageous behavior both exhilarating and harmless. She was proud to see her son growing up to be an individual with his own vision of the world. "There's more than enough sheep in this world, Dad," she would argue with her equally stubborn husband. "Just let the boy be." Speaking to Hunter Davies once again, George said of those early years, "My mom did encourage me, perhaps most of all by never discouraging me from anything that I wanted to do. That was a really good thing about her and my dad. If you tell kids not to, they're going to do it in the end anyway, so they might just as well hurry and get it over with. They let me stay out all night and have a drink when I wanted to, so I'd finished with all that bit by the time everyone else was just coming into it. That's probably why I don't really like alcohol much today. I had it all by the age of 10. A true rebel, by his 16th birthday, George was at the very bottom of his class at the Liverpool Institute, and often in deep water at home as well. Although he made no bones about his feelings for school, he was secretly nervous about leaving without benefit of even the most basic qualifications. To be able to sit for the General Certificate of Education, a student had to first pass the preliminary exam given by his teachers. The minimum requirement was successful completion of at least 3 subjects relevant to one's choice of career. George, however, failed dismally in all of his classes, except art. While most of the other students spent their Wednesday afternoons panting around the school track, says George, I was content to take a notebook and dream up sketches. They were mostly from my head, not from anything around me. I was fond of sports, too, especially swimming, but I guess I was fonder of art. The Institute's answer was to suggest that he be held back to try again next year. Afraid of what sort of unpleasantness this unhappy news might cause at home, George took the coward's way out and burned his report. During the last few months of the school year, he seldom even bothered turning up for classes. Instead, he often spent the lunch money his mother gave him on weekday matinees at the local cinema, sitting for hours slumped down in the tattered theater seats, hoping none of the grown-ups around would question his presence there. Other times he would cycle around over to the home of his big brother Harry's girlfriend Irene, later Harry's wife, where they would happily chat away the afternoon. Promptly at 3:45, he would cycle back to the Speke estate, no one any the wiser. Finally, however, the inevitable happened, and George was forced to own up to his parents about his failure at school. After the dust had settled, the Harrisons tried their best to understand. The only thing left now was for their youngest son to find himself a good steady job somewhere, qualifications or not, and make the best of it. George, though, couldn't think of any line of work he wanted to pursue. Harrison, increasingly cynical beyond his years, was not about to accept a position as a lowly bus conductor or a milkman. He was definitely meant for something better, something with a real future. Ultimately, however, George saw the wisdom of compromise and grudgingly accepted a £1.50 a week position as an apprentice electrician at Blackler's, a Liverpool department store. His father was delighted and proudly presented his son with a first-class set of electrical screwdrivers that Christmas. Several of George's relatives have since said that they felt Harry had it in his head that with 3 of his sons busy working at vaguely related trades, young Harry was a mechanic and Peter an auto body worker, they might consider going into business together. A family-owned garage, Mr. Harrison figured, would be just the ticket. He, of course, would be the manager, his wife Louise the bookkeeper, and his sons would do most of the labor. A happy dream, to be sure. After only a brief time on the job, though, George had had enough. He soon recognized that mindlessly cleaning endless strings of Christmas tree lights with a paintbrush or scrubbing out the gents was certainly not appropriate work for a young man of his great potential, whatever that was. Although George's parents weren't pleased with this latest development, once again they were supportive. Of course, if George had stuck it out at school, received his certificate, and then gone on to a steady job in Liverpool, the world might never have had the Beatles. A fact George has always been keenly aware of. Today, it's the funny little things that George remembers about life in Liverpool. Quirky, seemingly unrelated images strung together on a chain of golden memories. Pictures of pushy, tobacco-stained vicars chatting up housewives for donations. Little red-faced insurance salesmen toting their tatty imitation leather briefcases around the noisy streets. Pot-bellied masters from the Institute marching up and down the cricket fields, followed by a scruffy band of schoolboy soldiers singing out their off-key cadence into Liverpool's late-afternoon hustle-bustle. The rowdy merchant sailors, street vendors, pitiful alleyway drunkards, tight-lipped babies, and, of course, the Norse famous bounty of pretty girls. All characters right out of the Beatles' Penny Lane, all striking by their own peculiar sense of normalcy, and all still very, very real to George Harrison. There are magical places, too, that still simmer fondly in George's consciousness. A highly polished giant meteorite set into cement outside the Wavertree Baths that, after careening around the Milky Way for 1,000,000 years or so, ended up its journey on a farmer's muddy field in suburban Liverpool. Young George used to scramble up on top and then gaily slide back down. It is still there today. Then there was Calderstone Park, the library, and the mysterious tunnels leading the way to Childwall Five-Ways. None of these places is on the tourist maps handed out to out-of-town Beatle fans by the Merseyside Tourist Board. These are secret places, reserved only for the people of Liverpool. The real Liverpool. The Liverpool Carl Jung called the pool of life. The heady stuff that dreams are made of, and about which songs are composed and sung. Chapter 2. Highway of Diamonds. Early Musical Discovery. We were made, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, because of what we did last time. It was all there for us on a plate. We're reaping what we sowed in our last life, whatever it was. That's really all there is to it, Squire. George Harrison. Behind the wheel of his big green bus, Harry Harrison was a stern and cautious professional, methodically making sure that every fare was paid, all elderly patrons safely seated, and troublemakers quickly subdued or unceremoniously ejected. This motorized juggernaut of the roadway neatly knocked off its stops with a cool precision that passerbys could set their watches to. I was the best driver I could be, he said back in 1974. It always meant a lot to me to do any job as well as I could. My dad was the same. We Harrisons have always taken a lot of pride in our work. Off-duty, however, Harry was just one of the lads. Gregarious and sociable, he spent a lot of time at the Liverpool Corporation Centre for Conductors and Drivers at Finch Lane, drinking and carousing with his mates. His easy congeniality and genuine concern for workers' rights quickly led him to be elected a top union official. Once again, Harry's dedication to duty had paid off. By the mid-1950s, the ambitious Harrison was the regular Saturday night master of ceremonies at the union's weekly social. Once on stage, the normally reserved driver suddenly came to life, all smiles and corny jokes. He later said, "We always had a lot of fun back then. No one took it very seriously, though. Of course, it wasn't really show business at all, was it? Still, it was as close as I personally ever care to get." One thing we can take a little credit for, however, was helping to launch the career of comedian Ken Dodd. He used to come in every once in a while for a drink, so of course after a bit we all realized how marvelously funny he really was. "Why don't you get up and do your act on stage, Ken?" I asked him one evening. "Oh, not me, mate." Too nervous he was. Eventually, though, we wore him down, and of course he ended up a big star. In addition to Harry's duties as MC, he and Louise conducted ballroom dancing lessons at the Conductors Club for more than 10 years. Louise especially was exceedingly fond of music, and their tidy home often swung to the big band sounds of Ted Heath or her personal favorite, Victor Sylvester. George remembers hearing Hoagie Carmichael's Hong Kong Blues, as well as the old novelty tune, One Meatball. He even remembers standing on a little leather chair at about age 4 and singing his very own version of these songs at a friend of his parents', the Baby Beatles' very first public performance. In addition, George often squatted down behind the family's sitting room sofa from time to time for an impromptu puppet show, much to his parents' delight. The indication that George was seriously interested in music came when he was 13. She happened to notice that his school exercise books were virtually covered with crude little sketches of guitars. Soon afterwards, she bought her son a cheap 3-pound acoustic from the father of one of George's schoolmates. Surprisingly, young Master Harrison didn't really seem interested and relegated the gift to an upstairs cupboard for the next 3 months. When he eventually picked it up, he found it frustratingly difficult to learn and almost packed it in several times before finally making just a little progress. Sitting up some nights until nearly dawn with his mum to encourage him, he practiced until his fingers bled. With practice and determination, often listening to pop records and trying to mimic what he just heard, George began to play quite well and outgrew the battered old acoustic that had served him so faithfully. His mum once again came to the rescue by saving up her extra household money to buy him yet another guitar. This one, a good solid wide-body acoustic with a white inlaid trim, cost £30 and featured a handy cutaway neck for easier maneuverability on the lower frets of the fingerboard. Proud and independent, young George was determined to reimburse his mother just as soon as he could. It just wasn't in the lad's makeup to accept from anyone what he considered charity. As a result, he soon signed on as a Saturday afternoon delivery boy for a local butcher. George's natural aversion to fleshless food slowly gained momentum as he cycled through the narrow back streets of Speck with a full load of raw meat packed into his dusty saddlebags. It is tempting to speculate whether these early memories later inspired his militant anti-meat-eating song Piggies on the Beatles' White Album. It was during one of his deliveries that Harrison met Tony Bramwell, who, like George, was an enthusiastic rock and skiffle fan. Tony happened to mention that he had been lucky enough to meet Buddy Holly during the singer's last whirlwind tour of Great Britain. George was greatly impressed, although he too had a similar tale to tell. His brother Harry explains. In 1958, Lonnie Donegan was appearing at the Empire Theatre, and of course George just had to go. In fact, he borrowed the money from our parents so that he could see every single show. Anyway, he found out where Lonnie was staying, which happened to be a house in Speke, so George went around and hammered on the door until he came out and gave George his autograph. Of course, he immediately raced home to show the entire family. With so much in common, the two boys soon became chums, and their talk inevitably turned to music. I used to lend George all of my Buddy Holly records so he could try and learn the various chords and riffs, remembers Tony. We played them all so much that by the time we'd finished, they were just about ready for the bin. Sometime later, George set his sights on getting his first electric guitar. Candy Apple Red he thought would be perfect, just like the one his hero, Skiffle King Lonnie Donegan, played. His brother Harry remembers that George's first guitar came to a very sad end. He had rested it up against a wall and was talking to a mate when someone suddenly pushed back a chair right into it. Although George had it repaired, it was never the same again. What he really wanted, though, was an electric guitar. But Dad wasn't keen on him having it on hire purchase. He always said that you shouldn't buy anything unless you had the money to pay for it. Anyway, one night George, who was then working for Blackler's, came round to my flat. He went into a long speech about how much better an electric model would be. I knew he was working up to something, but I said nothing. Then he finally came out with it. He knew that Dad wouldn't let him have anything on hire purchase, so he wanted me to sign the guarantee forms. Now, I wasn't really very keen, but he finally persuaded me to go to Hessie's, the Liverpool shop where all of the groups bought their instruments. There he showed me the guitar he wanted, and it was priced at a whopping £120. George fiddled with it, trying to look like an expert, but no sound came out. So the salesman pushed a button on the amplifier, and suddenly there was a tremendous blast, and all of the instruments on the opposite wall crashed to the floor. After that, I just had to let poor George have that guitar. Still marking time at the Liverpool Institute, George shuttled back and forth to school on his father's bus in a dreamy haze of guitars and pop stars. The long, rambling ride took up to an hour each way, which also allowed him the boyhood luxury of mucking about with the other lads. One of the boys, the son of a cotton salesman and the estate's midwife from Allerton, was especially good fun. His name was Paul McCartney, and although he was a full year ahead of George at school, the two had quite a lot in common. Like George, McCartney was also intensely interested in music, and not only played the guitar but also held the proud distinction of owning his very own trumpet, which greatly impressed young Harrison. At home, George often used to perch himself in a stool in the middle of the sitting room and strum along to his favorite skiffle tunes with his brother Pete, a fair musician himself. The two brothers even played a gig together at the British Legion Club in 1956, with Pete's schoolhood chum Arthur Kelly and one or two others calling themselves the Rebels. This first engagement was memorable in that none of the other groups scheduled to play turned up, so the rocking Rebels were forced to entertain for the entire evening. Louise remembers all the boys ducking down behind the hedges on their way to the show that night, as George insisted that none of the nosy neighborhood women would be clued in to what was up. "I remember the Rebels had a tea chest with a lot of gnomes around it," says George. "One of my brothers had a 5-shilling guitar which had the back off of it. Apart from that, it was all fine. Just my brother, some mates, and me. I tried to lay down the law a bit, but they weren't having any of that. We thought we made a pretty good sound, but so did about 4 million other groups in town." In those days, playing such a prestigious gig was big news, so the next morning George excitedly scrambled to the bus stop to tell his mate Paul every detail. Not long afterwards, Paul, too, was joining George in the Harrisons' cozy front room to struggle through the well-worn chord books the boys carried around in their school bags. George remembers. "Paul was very good at the harder chords, I must admit. After a time, though, we actually began playing real songs together like Don't You Rock Me Daddy-O and Besame Mucho. Paul knocked me out with his singing especially, although I remember him being a little embarrassed to really sing out, seeing we were stuck right in the middle of our parents' place with the whole family walking about. He said he felt a little funny singing about love and such around my dad. We must have both been really a sight. I bet the others were just about pissing themselves trying not to laugh." Whether chatting up young ladies at the local chippy or spending school holidays together, the two boys became virtually inseparable. George recalls one such eventful outing from those early years. "When I was 14, Paul and I went to Paddington in Devon on a hitchhiking holiday. It was a bit of a laugh because we ran out of money and had nowhere to sleep. So Paul suggested we sleep on the beach. Sand, however, is actually as hard as concrete when you lie on it all night. Another year, when we were hitchhiking in South Wales, we did actually sleep on concrete. We ran out of cash again, and Paul, once again, had the idea that we could sleep at the police station in one of the cells. Unfortunately, the police refused, but suggested we could kip at the grandstand of the local football club. With great difficulty, we climbed the wall surrounding the football ground, and with even greater difficulty got to sleep on the concrete steps of the grandstand. Just as day was breaking, I awoke to find the caretaker standing over us. "What are you doing in my grandstand?" he demanded. "Sleeping," croaked Paul. "Well, you're not any more." We didn't need telling twice. With 2 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle the world would later come to know as the Beatles now firmly in place, it was John Lennon's appearance on the scene that broadened and solidified this magical partnership. Paul remembers. "As it turned out, John and I were both mates with a fellow from Woolton called Ivan Vaughan. One summer day, July 6, 1957, Ivan invited me to come along with him to a fete at the parish church in Woolton. I remember coming up across from the field and hearing all this great music, which turned out to be coming from John's band, the Quarrymen's Little Tannoy System. I just thought, oh great, I'll listen to the band, because I was very much into the music. I remember John singing a lovely tune by the Dell Vikings he'd heard on the radio called Come Go With Me. Anyway, he didn't really know the words, so he just made up his own. Good bluesy stuff like Come, come, come and go with me down to the penitentiary. As I recall, he was playing banjo chords on his guitar, which only had about 4 strings on at the time. Actually, he looked very good. He had his glasses off, so he was really quite suave. As for me, that particular day I just happened to pick up an odd guitar that was lying around and started to play 20 Flight Rock. I knew a lot of the words, which was really very unusual back in those days. Later, we all went down to the pub, and of course I had to try and kid the barman I was really 18. A couple of weeks later, John's friend Pete Shotton cycled up to Allerton and invited me to join the group. Paul McCartney first laid eyes on John Lennon at, of all places, the neighborhood chip shop. Beyond that, he thinks he may have seen him once or twice as a young teddy boy, climbing aboard a Liverpool bus bound for Woolton Village. McCartney was invited to join the Quarrymen on the merit of his mastery of 20 Flight Rock, as well as his justly famous Little Richard imitation. His obvious talents were a welcome addition to the ragtag group of schoolboy musicians. John was really the only outstanding member, says Paul. All the rest sort of slipped away, you know? I suppose the drummer was pretty good actually for what we knew then. Frankly, one of the reasons they all liked Colin Hanton was because he happened to have the Coasters record named Searchin', and that was pretty impressive currency back then. I mean, sometimes you made a whole career with someone solely on the basis of them owning a particular record. Paul's tour of duty as one of John's quarrymen continued almost a full year before George was even introduced to Woolton's bad boy band leader. George recalls their meeting in late 1957. I'd been invited to see them play several times by Paul, but for some reason I never got around to it. I remember being very impressed with John's big, thick sideboards and trendy teddy boy clothes. He was terribly sarcastic right from day one, but I never dared to back down to him. In a way, all that emotional rough stuff was simply a way for him to help separate the men from the boys, I think. I was never intimidated by John. Whenever he had a go at me, I just gave him back a little bit of his own, right back. Deeply drawn in by the charismatic spell cast by the masterful Lennon, young Paul McCartney reveled in his role as John's onstage foil and steady street corner accomplice. But though their musical assets were admittedly shaky within the structure of the Quarrymen, the two, however, were both admirable and ambitious. What they really needed, however, was a good solid guitar upon which to hang their funky backstreet skiffle sound. Paul remembers the events leading up to their finally settling on George. Well, he was always my little mate. Nonetheless, he could really play guitar, particularly this piece called Raunchy, which we all used to love. You see, if anybody could do something like that, it was generally enough to get them in the group. Of course, I knew George long before any of the others, as they were all from Woolton, and we hung out with the Allerton set. I can tell you both learned guitar from the same book, and despite his tender years, we were chums. John Lennon, however, was apparently quite skeptical about admitting such a veritable baby into the group. How would it look for someone as talented and popular as John to be caught consorting with someone so young and obviously undistinguished as George Harrison? What would his mates think, let alone the ladies? After all, the whole point of being in a band in the first place was to look like a big man, and that was admittedly a little tough to do playing with a teeny-bopper guitarist like Harrison. In the end, however, George's exceptional musical skill, coupled with McCartney's insistence that Harrison be brought on board, overruled Lennon's initial reservations. George played Raunchy for them in a cellar club called the Morgue, then hung around the band until he was invited to play with them. He was formally accepted as a member on February 6, 1958. McCartney, however, tells a slightly different tale. He says George's audition took place atop a Liverpool-bound bus. George slipped quietly into one of the seats aboard this largely deserted bus we were riding, took out his guitar, and went right into Raunchy. A few days later I said to John, "Well, what do you think?" And he finally says, "Yeah, man, he'd be great." And that was simply that. George was in. Becoming a quarryman, though, didn't mean that George wasn't interested in playing with other people. Former bandmate Ken Brown recalls some of the particulars of George's musical curiosity. It was the summer of 1958, and Harrison and I were playing in the Les Stewart Quartet with a chap called Skinner. We spent hours practicing in the Lowlands Club on Hayman's Green. We would probably have gone on to playing at clubs but for George's girlfriend, Ruth Morrison. George had never really been keen on girls. Remember, he was still only 15 and at school. Later, he suddenly seemed to go head over heels for Ruth, who later moved to Birmingham to become a nurse. Anyway, one evening the three of us were sitting in the Lowlands drinking coffee and moaning about the fact that we had nowhere regular to play, when Ruth suggested we go see Mrs. Best at the Casbah. Mrs. Best promised that the Les Stewart Quartet would play at the club when it opened. On the Saturday we were due to open, however, I went round to Les's house. George was sitting in the lounge with his Hofner guitar across his lap, idly plucking at the strings. The atmosphere seemed a bit tense. "What's up?" I asked George, but George just looked down at his guitar and said nothing. So I turned to Les. He looked daggers. "You've been missing practice, Ken," he said. "Oh, I know," I replied, "but only so we can have somewhere to play. I've spent hours working at the club." "And you've been getting paid for it, too," challenged Les. "No, I haven't." "Well, I'm not going to play there," said Les, as our argument got steadily more heated. "Look," I said, "the club opens tonight. We've spent months waiting for this. You're not backing out, are you?" George thought for a moment, then he said he would walk home with me. So we left Les at the house. As we were walking down the road, I turned to George and said, We can't let Mrs. Best down now. Let's try and get a group together ourselves. Do you know anyone?" "Well, there's two mates I sometimes play with out in Woolton," ventured George. "Okay, let's ask them," I said, and off George went on the bus, joining me 2 hours later at the Casbah with his two mates, who just happened to be John and Paul. This was the first time I had met them. Now, Paul was still at school and had a schoolboy haircut, but John was a bit of a beatnik, with his hair hanging well out over his collar, dressed in a checkered suit coat and old jeans. I told them we would each be paid 15 bob a night. They seemed glad about that, as most groups played just for the experience. We went down great, particularly when Paul sang Long Tall Sally. Our most popular numbers were with Lennon and McCartney on vocals. I was the rhythm guitarist. Now, John's pet solo was on Three Cool Cats, which he used to growl into the mic. Now that the Quarrymen had finally found a steady place to play in Mona Best's accommodating black basement, all that was needed was somewhere reasonable to rehearse. For a while, John and George frequented the ceramic-tiled front entranceway to John's Auntie Mimi's house, but sometimes got rather cold busking in such close proximity to Mother Nature. As far as our music went, remembers Paul, I recall playing our guitars out in front inside the porch. I think we might even learn the chords to Blue Moon in there as well, if I'm not mistaken. From what John has told me, Mimi often banished him out there from about the first day he brought home his guitar on account of all of the noise. But it ultimately worked out okay, I guess, as we kind of liked the echo in there, with the guitars bouncing off the tiles. Soon, however, this idea was abandoned in favor of full Quarrymen practice sessions in Springwood at the home of John's wonderfully free-spirited mother, Julia. Lennon's half-sister Julia Baird remembers the delightful ruckus. Our toilet was probably one of the tiniest in all of Great Britain, and to see John, Paul, George, Pete Shotton, Ivan Vaughan, and Mummy all scrambling around inside trying to find a place to sit was truly a wondrous sight indeed. Perched precariously atop the commode, tucked like sardines into the bathtub, or tentatively saddling up to the sink, they somehow managed not only to fit, but to actually play. And as Paul remembers, it was the best room in the house, hands down. Quite crowded, too, as I recall. Don't forget, it wasn't only us in there, but also our instruments. Many a fine tune has been written in that little room, let me tell you. The lineup for these unusual sessions was generally John, Paul, and George on acoustic guitars, Pete Shotton on string bass, and John's uninhibited mother on either washboard or playing percussion with the aid of her favorite kitchen utensils. Another place the budding Beatles found sanctuary was with George's mum. Louise was more than willing to open up her drawing room to the boys for practice, while she scrambled about, serving bacon butties and, of course, endless cups of hot, milky tea. "I remember the very first time John came round," says Harry. As far as young Lennon was concerned, however, he was certainly the kingpin, all right. Chapter 3. Securely in the JFK Position. Worldwide Beatlemania. We were just a bunch of loonies taking drugs and trying to be honest. George Harrison. There was a time when George really had no faith at all that the Beatles would ever really click, Harry Harrison has said. I vividly remember him going on about the lot of us packing up and immigrating to Australia. Then it was Canada, and even Malta for a time. Just stick with the music, boy, I told him. If you really want it bad enough, you will catch your star. Of all of the Beatles, George Harrison was perhaps least likely to have stayed in show business if the Beatles hadn't finally caught on. Adventure was what he was after, and money. In the early days with manager Brian Epstein, it was Harrison who was most concerned with the business of contracts and record royalties. In the early days of rock and roll, playing music had not so much to do with artistry as much as setting oneself above the crowd, says Harrison Riley. We looked at fellows like Buddy Holly and Elvis and thought, that looks like a good job. Money, travel, chicks, nice threads. There's a great deal to be said for playing rock and roll. The boys' first notable tour was in May 1960 when they backed pop singer Johnny Gentle in Scotland on what Harrison's buddy Legs Larry Smith called the sellotape and chewing gum circuit. The 2-week tour took the band, now called the Silver Beatles, to the northernmost tip of Scotland, where they played dingy working men's clubs and tatty teenage ballrooms all along the eastern coast. John's art school chum, bass player Stuart Stutcliffe, by now had joined the band, as had drummer Tommy Moore. To effect a more professional air, the young men adopted stage names. George became Carl Harrison, after his rock idol Carl Perkins. John was renamed Johnny Silver. Paul was now Paul Raymond. Stuart became Stu DeStille. And Tommy Moore did not change his name. As undistinguished as that first tour may have been, it did give the band a little taste of fame, and they were hooked. "Someone asked me for my autograph," Paul proudly wrote home to his dad. George, too, had particular reason to brag. He and Gentle had become quite chummy, and when they returned from Scotland, the singer presented George with one of Eddie Cochran's old stage shirts as a memento. "That tour was our first faint hope of actually making it one day," Harrison has said. By the early summer of 1960, the prospects for the band were dwindling. By all accounts, Tommy Moore had been quite good in the Skins, but being significantly older than the others, wasn't about to make a career of bashing about with a local two-bit beat group. A month after the tour, during which Tommy had the misfortune of losing his two front teeth when the group's van collided with a car full of senior citizens, Moore unceremoniously bailed. The effect on the band was devastating, for no one would ever hire them without a drummer. Fortunately, the answer to the Beatles' prayer soon came in the person of one Randolph Peter Best, a strikingly handsome, though sometimes uncomfortably quiet young man. Not only did he have a great new kit, but his mom Mona had her own teen club, an irresistible combination. A few months later, Alan Williams, the diabolical Welshman who had arranged some earlier bookings for the boys, was in a trendy London coffee bar called the Two Eyes when he ran into German nightclub owner Bruno Koschmider. "Do you think you could fix me up with a Liverpool group to take back home?" Koschmider inquired. "Sure thing," Williams shot back. "One of the city's best." The band he had in mind was in fact Derry and the Seniors, a well-organized beat group much loved in Merseyside. Their gig went well, and soon Williams was again called upon to help import more of Liverpool's raucous brand of rock and roll to Hamburg's music-loving teens. This time, though, the boys were not passed over. Despite strong objections from their families, in August 1960, the Beatles piled into Williams' battered van and barreled off to the Channel Ferry and on to Germany. Pete Best recalls their arrival in Hamburg. "We immediately made our way down to the Kaiserkeller, the club we were supposed to be playing. The place was really jumping, had terrific atmosphere, and was otherwise most impressive. Unfortunately, Koschmider was soon to burst our bubble. 'Oh no, lads, you're playing the Indra at the bottom of the street,' he told us, which certainly took us down a peg or two. If the living at the Indra was rough, the work was rougher still, as the boys were expected to perform 8 hours every night, a far cry from the tidy 45-minute sets they played back home. In his biting memoir, The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, Alan Williams recalls the Beatles' first days in Germany. At the Indra, the clients had of course come to see a girly show. Word hadn't yet gotten around that there were no girls anymore, and that a beat group called the Beatles from Liverpool was the star attraction. Look, they did their best, but the clients just weren't interested. 'Bring on the girls,' they shouted. They felt cheated. The scene did the boys no good at all. Within a week, Bruno had cancelled the gig, and the Indra once again reverted to the fine art of the tease. The boys couldn't have been happier, as Koschmider now let them share the bill with Derry and the Seniors back at the Kaiserkeller. George Harrison once listed his tour of duty in Hamburg as his only higher education, and he wasn't far wrong. To the Beatles, Hamburg's raw, uncensored lifestyle gave them a kind of carte blanche to act out their most violent and aggressive fantasies. For years, sources close to the group have told lurid tales of drunken barroom brawls, street fights with jealous boyfriends, and all manner of explicit sexual escapades, both hetero and homosexual. Undeniably, the savage young Beatles were heavy drinkers, but there has never been even one single shred of evidence to suggest that the boys' bedroom habits were anything less than 100% heterosexual, despite the rumors. As time went by, the musically growingly sophisticated Beatles began to attract a more interested and discerning following, winning over scores of adventurous students and would-be artists who had come to frequent the Kaiserkeller. Of these, 3 had grown particularly close to the Beatles by virtue of their artistic interest in the group: Klaus Voormann, Astrid Kircher, and Jürgen Vollmer. Vormann, the son of a prominent Berlin physician, happened to be walking around St. Pauli one night when he heard what sounded like a pretty wild rock band coming from a smoky basement club, so he decided to duck in for a moment and check it out. Ironically, it was not the Beatles he heard, but rather their arch-competitors, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, with drummer Ringo Starr. Altogether, the Beatles' first trek to Hamburg lasted just over 4 months. Although they found playing the Kaiserkeller infinitely preferable to the cramped and seedy Indra, they weren't entirely happy with Bruno Koschmider's bullying tactics, nor with the deplorable living conditions they were forced to endure. As a result, they approached local club manager Peter Eckhorn and requested an audition with an eye towards transferring their talents to his Top 10 club, an even grander version of the somewhat scruffy Kaiserkeller. The Top 10 was anxious to have the Beatles as their star attraction, but Bruno Koschmider was distressed at the thought of losing his biggest draw to his competitor. Unfortunately for Koschmider, the Beatles' contract with him was about to expire, leaving the group free to perform wherever they chose. And they wasted no time. One evening, without any notice, the boys were gone, off to play the Top 10 for their new boss, Peter Eckhorn. As far as the Beatles were concerned, after having lived rough for so long, their only loyalty now was to themselves. Precisely 24 hours after the boys had moved into their new rooms, they were awakened by a loud knock at the door. "Police, you must open up." The boys scrambled out of bed and hurried to get dressed. Lennon stumbled into the hallway and cracked open the door just enough to make sure the visitors weren't a team of Koschmider's muscle-bound enforcers sent round to make the lads an offer they could not refuse. That, however, was the only invitation the police required, and suddenly the room was wall-to-wall cops. "We are looking for the one called Harrison," one of the cops barked. Everyone froze. "What the fuck do you want him for?" said Lennon, surprisingly belligerent in the face of such authority. "He hasn't done anything." Apparently the police had received an anonymous tip that George was only 17 and was therefore too young to be playing in an adult club past curfew. On top of that, the Beatles had not bothered to secure either visas or work permits before the band came to perform in Germany. George was to be deported immediately. There was no way out of this one. The boys had been had by someone with a grudge, someone very like Bruno Koschmider. After returning home to Liverpool, the boys were quite demoralized and didn't even bother getting in touch with each other for almost a week. Paul, meanwhile, had accepted a job on a delivery truck, handing parcels around the city for a scant £7 a week. The lads eventually got back together, however, to play a gig on December 17th, but it was their December 27th show at the Litherland Town Hall that marked the beginning of the Beatles' rise to the top in Liverpool. Playing in Hamburg had a profound effect on their music. Their repertoire was extensive, their playing clean and succinct, and their vocalizing energetic and compelling as never before. It was soon after that they would begin their legendary residency at the iconic Cavern Club on Matthew Street. To George Harrison, the Beatles' eventual success at the Cavern prophesied even better things to come. Gone were the nagging doubts that had plagued the young man, and also those of his father, who wasn't really all that keen on his son pursuing a career in music. Perhaps he could make a decent living playing guitar after all. By the early spring of 1961, the Beatles were one of Merseyside's top bands, but were still virtually unknown outside their hometown. By now, George had turned 18, so the group returned to Hamburg to play the Top 10 from April through July 1961. While there, they had been invited to sit in on a recording session with transplanted English pop singer Tony Sheridan, who was perhaps Hamburg's most popular entertainer. Although the Beatles had recorded a few times previously, once as the Quarrymen in a friend's basement studio in Liverpool, and then in the fall of 1960 at Acoustic Studios in Hamburg, these were the first truly professional sessions. Produced by the well-known orchestra leader Bert Comfort, the boys recorded 8 tunes, 6 backing Sheridan, and 2 others, a rocked-up version of My Bonnie and a Harrison-Lennon original, Cry for a Shadow. Released as a single in Germany in August 1961, a few imported copies of My Bonnie made their way back to England, and before long the obscure 45 was occasionally being spun in a few Liverpool-area discos. all of which prompted 18-year-old Raymond Jones to wander into local businessman Brian Epstein's NEMS, or Northeast Music Stores shop in the Whitechapel section of Liverpool on October 28, 1961, and request a copy of the hard-to-find Signal. Mr. Epstein had always prided himself on his ability to rustle up even the most obscure records for his customers, but this particular order had him stumped. What's more, none of Brian's many contacts in the music business had even heard of the band, much less their fly-by-night single. Coincidentally, a couple of weeks later, while chatting with one of his sales clerks, he learned that the mystery group was playing only a few hundred feet away at the tiny basement club on Matthew Street. He was intrigued. A little after noon on November 9, 1961, Brian and his personal assistant Alistair Taylor visited the cavern to hear for themselves this swinging ensemble known as the Beatles. 34 days later, during a meeting at Pete Best's house, a formal management agreement was negotiated between the Beatles and Epstein's NEMS Enterprises. Brian didn't actually sign the document, but simply shook hands as a show of faith. After all, unlike these four young scruffs, Epstein was a gentleman, and his word was therefore his bond. At any rate, the deal was done. The Beatles finally had themselves an official manager, and Epstein yet another pet project to occupy his otherwise tediously lonely life. Little did either party suspect what was about to happen to them in just a few short months. On April 10, just as the boys were about to leave for the local airport, an urgent telegram was received from Astrid. Suddenly taken ill at her mother's house in Altona, a Hamburg suburb, Stu had collapsed and was rushed by ambulance to the hospital. He never made it, dying en route, cradled in Astrid's arms. The ultimate cause of Stuart's death remains largely a mystery to this day, although it was probably a brain hemorrhage. Paul, Pete, and John immediately flew to Germany to be with Astrid. When they met George and Stu's mother at the airport the next day, there wasn't a dry eye to be found anywhere, remembered Epstein years later. That is, all except for John, who I'm afraid had drawn all of his hurt deep inside in an effort to mask his true feelings. I always had a lot of fights with Stuart, but I really liked him, and we were really very close friends before he died, George has said. This was the first time someone close to Harrison had passed away. I know he felt just terrible for Astrid, George's mother commented. I remember him writing home from Germany, chock full of stories saying, Stu and John did this, Astrid and the lads went there. In those days anyway, they were still very close. It was a measure of the Beatles' deep affection for the young artist that 5 years later his picture would be featured among the pantheon of famous faces appearing on the legendary Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band LP. It was at this time that the first faint rumblings of the upheaval that lay ahead began to make an impression on Harrison. Hundreds flocked to see the boys perform nightly at the Star Club. Brian Epstein, meanwhile, in an all-or-nothing assault on London's jaded record executives, secured a recording contract with EMI through producer George Martin in July 1962. Upon their return to Liverpool, drummer Pete Best was soon sacked in favor of the charismatic Ringo Starr. Stu, however, did not need to be replaced, as Paul McCartney had taken over duties on bass. By the fall of 1963, full tilt, die-hard Beatlemania had descended upon the British Isles. By Christmas time, the band had played the prestigious Royalty Variety performance, toured Sweden, scored a #1 single with I Want to Hold Your Hand, and consummated the deal for their first full-length motion picture, A Hard Day's Night. In January 1964, I Want to Hold Your Hand entered the American record charts at number 83. By the next week, it had climbed steadily to 42 and showed no signs of leveling off. Days later, while the Beatles were in Paris, they received a call from New York informing them that their turbulent teenage love call had toppled Bobby Vinton's There, I've Said It Again, and was now #1 on the charts. Later, on board Pan Am Flight 101 from London's Heathrow to New York's Kennedy Airport on February 7, 1964, George Harrison and his 3 colleagues were very anxious. America's got everything, thought Harrison out loud. Why should they want us? On top of feeling almost unbearable apprehension, George was also sick with the flu and concerned that his hair didn't look quite right following a last-minute shampoo back in London. No small worry for a group to whom hair is such an important part of the act. Brian Epstein, meanwhile, though trying to appear calm, was concerned that Harrison's ill health would prevent him from playing either The Ed Sullivan Show or Carnegie Hall. As it turned out, Brian had good reason to worry about George's illness. Almost immediately after arriving at the Plaza Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, George took to his bed. A doctor was called, and George's sister Louise moved into an adjacent room to nurse him. To further preserve the Beatles' strength, Neil Aspinall stood in for him on rehearsals for The Ed Sullivan Show. In the end, George did rally, however, and sustained by various medication, managed to get through the show. He even used his time in bed to do telephone interviews with DJs across the country. After their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, which was seen by a record 73 million viewers, the entourage boarded a train bound for Washington, D.C. on the morning of February 11. That night they played before 20,000 screaming fans at the Coliseum. On Friday, February 21, the Beatles ended their 2-week mini-tour of North America, physically exhausted but basically relaxed, due in large part to a 5-day holiday Epstein had allowed them in Miami. Now that America and England had clearly fallen under their spell, the remainder of the world was sure to follow. Meanwhile, back in Liverpool, the Harrisons' tidy lives was being turned upside down by an avalanche of fans and fan mail, which ended up daily at their door. On George's 21st birthday, so many cards and presents were received that the post office had to dispatch several oversized mail vans to cope with the deluge. Outside the house, hundreds of screaming, swooning fans gathered to help celebrate the occasion, the teenage crowd eventually swelling to such proportions that the police had to be called in. Throughout the next few weeks, the Beatles were hard at work portraying themselves in their film debut, A Hard Day's Night. The film premiered on July 6, 1964, at the Pavilion Theatre in Piccadilly Circus, London. That August, the Beatles returned to America to begin a month-long tour. Although, frankly, they had little new to say musically, there was still heaps of money to be made and lots of people ready to help them cash in. This time around, the Beatles had the luxury of their own private jet, a Lockheed Electra, which gave them privacy, at least in the air. Back in the ground, however, it was the same old story. Everybody wanted the image to carry on, said John later. The press does too, because they all want the free drinks, the free whores, and the fun. Everybody wants to be on the bandwagon. One had to completely humiliate oneself to be what the Beatles were, Lennon later stated. It just happened bit by bit, gradually, until this complete craziness is surrounding you. Suddenly you're doing exactly what you don't want to with people you can't stand, the people you hated when you were 10. For all things Beatles, 1965 was yet another banner year. Again, there were the big shows, frantic tours, and the freaked-out fans. But by now, the Beatles were becoming very bored. In February, Walter Shenson got together with Richard Lester and a couple of well-known screenwriters and concocted the film Help. The plot was a rather thinly contrived cartoon-like comedy pairing off our heroes against a crazy tribe of bloodthirsty Hindus intent on sacrificing a terrified Ringo Starr. Although it was filmed almost entirely on location in the Bahamas, Austria, and England's Salisbury Plain, the company booked into Twickenham Film Studios on April 1 to shoot the movie's interiors. In the end, the Beatles were not particularly pleased with Help. The filming had been long and arduous and not particularly rewarding for the boys. Lennon explained, "Help was a drag because we didn't know what was happening. The fact is, Lester was ahead of his time with the Batman thing. But by that time we were all on pot, and we really didn't care." Perhaps the most dramatic happening of 1965 was George and John's accidental initiation into the wonderfully wacky world of LSD. It was at a dinner party hosted by the Beatles' London dentist. "I thought it was rather strange that he had taken the trouble to line up 4 sugar cubes in a neat row atop his mantel," she remembers. He then carefully dropped the 4 cubes into his guest's after-dinner coffee. For some reason, George's girl Patty Boyd was reluctant to finish hers, but at the polite insistence of their host, she graciously obliged. Retiring to the drawing-room, they were casually informed that the cubes had each contained a rather respectable dose of LSD, and they were advised to settle back and enjoy the avalanche of distorted sights and sounds which would surely follow. Cynthia and Patty were immediately terrified. "What if this turns out to be some sort of aphrodisiac?" Patty whispered to George. "Let's get the hell out of here," he said. "Perhaps he's trying for an orgy." Excusing themselves, the two couples piled into Harrison's car and were about to speed away when the dentist intercepted them at the curb. "Look, I wouldn't advise you to leave," he said sternly. "You don't understand what's about to happen. If you stay here, I guarantee your safety. But if you go, anything could happen." "We'll take our chances," yelled Harrison, and off they roared. Determined not to allow them to escape, the doctor and his girlfriend jumped into the taxi and took off in hot pursuit. Realizing that they were being tailed, George began careening through the wind-swept streets at breakneck speed. "It was like having the devil following us in a cab," Cynthia recalled. "We were all panic-stricken." Not really knowing where to go, Harrison stopped off at the Pickwick Club to see their old friend Klaus Vorman perform with his group Patty, Klaus, and Gibson. Once they were inside, the large, dimly lit room suddenly began pulsing with the music, which had slowed itself into an erratic, thumping soup. All eyes seemed to home in on the famous four. They felt as though they were being sucked into a great vacuum of disjointed sensory clutter. "Is everything going fast or slow?" wondered Lennon. Waves of euphoria rolled over them as they gasped in wonder at the swirling colors and patterns lighting up the darkened corners of the club. In the midst of it all, the dentist suddenly appeared and begged them to return to his flat. George looked upon what he considered the personification of evil itself and tore himself loose from his former friend's grasp. Once again, they fled. Their next stop, the famous Ad-Lib Club, seemed to be lit up like a Hollywood premiere, complete with hundreds of screaming fans. As they drew closer, however, they realized it was just the usual one small light outside the club's entrance. The year 1965, for all its tension and insecurity, also brought with it a few surprises. First, there was the Beatles' investiture by Queen Elizabeth as members of the Order of the British Empire, made public by Buckingham Palace on June 12th. The announcement was soon followed by several protests, with MBEs sent back from all over the world by irate members. Among them, Hector Dupis, a former Canadian member of Parliament, caused quite a furor with the fans when he called the boys vulgar nincompoops. George responded, "If Dupis doesn't want his medal, he had better give it to us. Then we can give it to our manager. MBE really stands for Mr. Brian Epstein." On October 26, 1965, the four Beatles were received by the Queen in Buckingham Palace's Great Gilded Hall. After a brief ceremony, the lads reportedly retired to the sanctity of the men's room to smoke a joint. Rumor has it they had brought along an extra spliff just in case they happened to run into Prince Charles. From February 2, 1963 to August 29, 1966, the Beatles played more than 225 shows in almost every country of the free world. They performed for millions of hysterical teeny boppers, were pelted with jelly beans, and constantly harassed by fans looking for souvenirs. Everything from autographs to bits of their hair, clothes, and even fingernails. Crippled children were wheeled into the boys' dressing rooms in hopes that a dose of their mysterious power might somehow restore or straighten lifeless limbs and twisted bodies. Airport terminals were continually dirtied by young women who became incontinent when at last they caught up with their favorite Beatle. It was, all in all, quite a lot of madness for four provincial young men from the north of England to endure. And so, when the Beatles laid down their instruments after their last number at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29, 1966, they said goodbye to public performing forever. From then on, John, Paul, George, and Ringo would devote themselves exclusively to working their magic only in the privacy and sanctity of the recording studio. George Harrison, for one, couldn't have been more pleased. Chapter 4. Two Hearts, George and Patty. When George got together with Patty, Mrs. Harrison and I were delighted. Of course, to the rest of the world it might have been Beatle Mary's model, but to those that really knew them it was clear that this was a genuine modern-day love story. Harry Harrison. In 1964, Pattie Boyd, born Patricia Ann Boyd on March 17, 1945, was a pretty blonde print model enjoying great success in London when Richard Lester, a transplanted American television director, saw her in a magazine and hired her to appear in commercials as the Smiths' Crisp Girl. In addition to her work on TV, she also did promotional appearances for the Smith firm all over England, appearing mostly at charity fetes and department stores. Following her great success as England's potato chip princess, Pattie was cast by Lester in a tiny role in the Beatles' pseudo-documentary A Hard Day's Night. George spotted her on the first day's filming and was overwhelmed by her big blue eyes, lovely long blonde hair, and sexy, kittenish personality. Standing around behind the scenes in her scant Mary Quant micro mini and pale Dolly Bird makeup, she looked like the epitome of swinging London at its best. At the end of that first day, Pattie and a couple of her mates summoned up the courage to actually walk up to all of the Beatles except John and ask for an autograph. To an innocent like Pattie, Lennon seemed entirely too caustic and cynical to run the risk of encountering him in a bad mood. George signed for one of my sisters and one for me, remembers Pattie. Underneath Jenny and Paula's, he drew a kiss for each, but under mine, 7 kisses. It was mildly embarrassing, but at the same time, quite exciting. During the next few days of filming, George's attention was definitely not on his work. Pattie often felt George's deep, dark eyes staring at her as she waited to do her scenes. On the second day, George invited her into the Beatles' private trailer for a cup of tea. She and her 2 younger sisters, Jenny and Paula, were from a steady middle-class home in the south of England, raised in a strict though affectionate environment where young ladies were taught to be both loving and loyal to their men. Pattie, therefore, politely declined the offer, telling the Beatle that she was already semi-engaged to another boy. On the third day, George tried again, this time asking her out for a proper date. Once again, she put him off, telling the thoroughly frustrated young man that she had an old-fashioned view of romance and couldn't see hurting her boyfriend over a casual night on the town. Later that afternoon, George decided to approach her one last time. She accepted, remember Harrison years later. We went out to dinner and then drove around London talking about everything we could think of. I don't know if you could actually call it love at first sight, but by the end of the first week, I had already met her mum. 3 weeks later, we were looking at houses together, so I guess you could definitely call us a couple. Pattie's initial exposure to the real world of Beatlemania came when Brian Epstein somewhat reluctantly engineered a whirlwind trip for George and Pattie to Western Ireland during Easter 1964, along with John and Cynthia. In a bizarre cat-and-mouse game with the media, everyone flew under assumed names, the girls taking a separate flight from Manchester to Heathrow. From there, the 2 couples boarded a private twin-engine plane for the bumpy flight to Dromoland Airport, safely tucked away in the outer reaches of the lovely Irish countryside. They were looking forward to their stay at the exclusive Dromoland Castle Hotel, but despite all precautions, word soon leaked out to the press that one half of the fabled Fab Four was in attendance. By the next morning, the lobby was crawling with reporters and photographers, all intent on nailing down the identity of the beautiful blonde George had reportedly spent the night with. Now that their secret romance was out, there was nothing left but to abandon their holiday and get back to London as quickly and discreetly as possible. The press, however, were posted at virtually all the hotel exits and stalked the corridors and stairwells in search of their prey. Meanwhile, the 2 couples were locked safely away in their rooms, planning the great escape. George was furious that his privacy had been invaded on such a personally important outing. "Don't we give those bastards big enough pounds of flesh every goddamn day of our lives?" he exploded. "Why can't they just leave us alone sometimes?" John could only agree. He and Sin had been living this crazy life together for so many years that even this kind of callous intrusion seemed just a seamy, unavoidable fact of life. A couple of hours later, John and George fought their way through the media to the front desk and attempted to check out. The girls stayed upstairs waiting for the right moment to make their getaway. "Who's the blonde, George? What's her name? Do you love her? Will you marry? Come on, John, where's the ladies?" The 2 young men were hopelessly surrounded, flash bulbs going off all around them. "Just one picture with her. We've come a hell of a long way, mate." "Well, so have we," screamed Lennon, suddenly unable to contain himself. "Now leave off. You've had your fucking party. Now we're getting the fuck out of here." With that, John grabbed George by the arm, and the two of them barreled head-on into the crowd. The press knew they were licked, yet not only continued to hurl questions, but now stinging insults. "You lot were finished anyway 6 months ago. Don't forget who made you yobs in the first place." Upstairs, Cynthia and Patty had disguised themselves as chambermaids and were tiptoeing carefully through the halls, pushing an oversized laundry cart filled with dirty linen. They took the service elevator in the hotel's laundry room and then jumped into the hamper, concealing themselves along with the used bed sheets. A bellboy then rolled the basket into the back of a laundry truck and sped madly through the rain-swept streets on his way to the airport. So intent was he on pleasing his pop star heroes with his good deed that it hadn't occurred to him that the two girls were still locked inside the hamper. Cynthia and Patty all but gave up hope of ever making it out of the country alive. John and George, meanwhile, had arrived by taxi at the airport some 15 minutes later and were waiting rather impatiently for the girls to show up. "Good old sin," chuckled Lennon when at last everyone reunited. "You look like a couple of right scrubbers." "Don't smell that great either," added George, just about falling down with laughter. "Let's get the hell out of here once and for all." Their little plane was met at London's Heathrow Airport by throngs of reporters and fans eager to pounce on George and his beautiful mystery girl. Running the gauntlet between the press and two Rolls-Royce limos Brian Epstein had hastily arranged, they scrambled back inside, locked the doors, and breathed a deep sigh of relief. "Well, Patty," said George offhandedly, "I guess our secret's finally out. It's official now. Model Patty and Beatle George have definitely become a very hot number." Hot enough that by early 1965, Patty had already moved in with George in his extravagant Esher bungalow outside of London, and was even writing a monthly column for 16 magazine in America entitled Patty's Letter from London. All was not sweetness and light, however, for the lucky couple, for as soon as word got around that the Harrison-Boyd liaison seemed to be serious, Patty began receiving bags of hostile, even frightening letters from George's loyal female fans. "It was terrified," admits Patty. "Hordes of wretched little girls used to lie in wait outside our gate waiting for me to go out to the shops. I was regularly kicked, bitten, and even punched solely because I was George's girlfriend. 'You better leave off our George or else,' they would shout as I drove away." George attempted to talk to them about it, but every time he came round they just fell about swooning and giggling. The next morning, however, once again they'd all be out in full force, screaming insults and sometimes actually threatening to murder me. Christmas 1965 was a whirlwind of activity for all those associated with the Beatles. Apart from their various recording dates and performances, there was the annual Beatles Christmas message to prepare for the fans, as well as the general push and shove of the holiday season. The Beatles were seldom too busy, however, to fit at least a little serious partying into their busy schedule, and this Yuletide was no exception. One of the highlights of this year's festivities was a big do at Brian Epstein's Chapel Street flat. It was on the way that George proposed, remembers Patty. "We were just motoring along, listening to the radio, when suddenly he very calmly told me he loved me and wanted us to get married. I think I just said yes or some such nonsense, but believe me, inside I was doing cartwheels. We really were very much in love." George and Patty were married on January 21st, 1966, at the Epsom Registry Office in Surrey. Paul McCartney was the only fab guest in attendance, but both John and Paul sent along their best wishes in the form of flowers and several extravagant wedding presents. Mrs. Harrison once told journalist Alana Nash, "I felt as if I had lost everything. Quite silly, really, as we were in the car with them returning from the ceremony. George took my hand and said, 'Look, it doesn't mean because I'm married I don't need you any more, Mum. We need you now more than ever. He's such a lovable son and cares about how people feel.'" The couple honeymooned in Barbados, just swimming, water skiing, and even doing a little deep-sea fishing. So happy and relaxed was the normally camera-shy George that he and Patty graciously consented to pose for photographers on the beach. To all the world, this was a match made in heaven, the sexy young guitar-playing millionaire and his vivacious supermodel wife. As the British tabloids hit the streets of London, even some of George's most die-hard fans began to soften. For George and Patty, it was a deliriously happy time. Julia Baird remembers a Sunday outing to the Harrisons' home not long after the wedding. Cynthia fortunately had volunteered to drive, so at least the ride over was not only very scenic, but much safer than if John had been driving. It was John, Julian, his son, his other half-sister Jackie, myself, and Sin, who, by the way, were very good friends with Patty in those days. I remember we sat on great huge pillows spread out on the immaculate hardwood floor and enjoyed a lovely lunch of cold chicken salad, a spicy Indian rice, accompanied by loads of fine red wine. It was a very cozy afternoon with lots of friendly conversation and good feelings all around. George seemed really sweet, though maybe just a little quiet, at least compared to our John with his mile-a-minute humor. Patty was certainly a very caring hostess as well, but Jackie and I just couldn't get over seeing her at Woolworth's in Liverpool at what seemed only a few months before, plugging away for Crisp Company. George seemed really sweet, though maybe a little quiet, at least compared to our John with his mile-a-minute humor. Patty was certainly a very caring hostess as well, but Jackie and I just couldn't get over seeing her at Woolworth's in Liverpool at what seemed only a few months before, plugging away for a Crisp Company. For George and Patty, life in Esher was very happy. They had friends, the challenge of their exciting careers, and of course, each other. Often Patty's sisters would come and stay for weeks at a time, keeping their big sister company evenings while George was in London recording with the Beatles. Later on, the girls even opened a small boutique in Kensington called Juniper, in honor of Donovan's romantic ballad, Jennifer Juniper. On those rare occasions when he was at home, George took an active interest in the garden and worked with his man Maurice to make sure everything was kept just so. Harrison and his old mate Klaus Voorman even painted a swirling psychedelic mural on the bungalow's stucco exterior. Some days, when there was no other pressing engagements, George would reach into his antique ivory pillbox and pick out a small pastel-colored tab of LSD and then trip out. Wandering through nearby Claremont Park, he would sink into a dreamy haze of good vibrations and warm sunshine. Other times he and Patty would stay in and, after a hearty home-cooked meal, quietly pass the time with friends, smoking bowls of black Moroccan hashish or nursing glasses of vintage wine. The beginning of the end of the Harrisons' time in Esher came about on the early evening of March 12, 1969, when Patty answered a knock at the door and found a half-dozen policemen crowding into the narrow archway. "Drug squad, madam," announced Sergeant Norman Pilcher, the officer in charge. "We have a warrant." Immediately, several constables and a couple of drug-sniffing dogs began their search of the house. "I think perhaps I should ring my husband," said Patty, as calmly as possible. Darting into the small nook between the sitting room and the den, she quickly dialed the Beatles' special hotline number connected to Apple, the Beatles' corporate headquarters in London. After talking to his wife for a few minutes, George thoughtfully replaced the receiver and told Apple fixer Peter Brown what was happening. Not missing a beat, Brown immediately rang Martin Polden, one of London's top lawyers. George, meanwhile, telephoned the Beatles' old crony Pete Shotton, who lived nearby in Esher, and asked him to stay with Patty until he could get there. When George arrived with Derek Taylor a while later, he found at least 10 police cars and a paddy wagon crowded outside his house. Everything was in an uproar, Shotton remembers. The coppers had virtually tipped out all the furniture and were tearing down the closets when George suddenly burst in. Everything came to an immediate halt as the bobbies jumped to their feet in rapt attention at the sight of Beatle George. "Just what are all these men in silly felt hats doing in my home anyway, giving my friend bad vibes?" shouted George at the top of his lungs. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," began the officer in charge, "I am charging you with the illegal possession of cannabis resin. I'm afraid I must ask you both down to the station for processing." George sarcastically inquired if they had actually found any of his pot, or they were instead featuring their own personal stash this evening. "And you needn't have turned the whole bloody place upside down either. All you had to do was ask me, and I would have shown you where I keep everything." Saying nothing, Pilcher just stuck out his hand as if to say, "After you," and everyone filed out of the house through George's garden en route to the Esher jail. As they walked to the cars, the coppers suddenly pulled in very close around George and Patty, so much so that they could hardly walk. "Look, I'm not going to run," said George. "Give us a little room, will you?" Before anyone knew what was happening, a photographer jumped out of some nearby bushes and popped off a series of flashbulbs in George's face. Like Lee Harvey Oswald being blown away by Jack Ruby, George went down, but immediately bounced right back up and charged after the cameraman with the entire drug squad hot on his heels. "I'm gonna fucking kill you, you bastard," Harrison bellowed. The photographer was terrified, dropped his camera, and never stopped running. Happily, George managed to stomp on the camera once or twice before being forcibly restrained by the cops. His good work, however, did not go unpunished, as several years later this author obtained copies of the scurrilous photographs. Once at the Esher jail, George and Patty were quickly charged and subsequently released on bail. Not wishing such a fine spring evening to be a total waste, the couple were driven home and then quickly changed for a party by London artist Rory McEwen at his studio in Chelsea. Arriving fashionably late, they were greeted by their host, who immediately steered them in the direction of his two celebrated guests, Princess Margaret and her husband Lord Snowdon. "Guess what?" said Harrison sheepishly. "We've been busted. Sergeant Pilcher and his goons planted a big block of hashish in my bedroom closet." "How terrible," said the princess sympathetically. "Do you think you might be able to get the charges dropped?" asked George. "No, I don't really think so. It could become a little sticky. Sorry, George." As if all of this wasn't awkward enough for the princess, Patty's youngest sister's Paula casually strolled up and offered Her Royal Highness a toke on a joint that was being passed around the room. As one can imagine, this little gesture didn't really go over all that well, and shortly thereafter the royals split the party. 19 days later, at Esher and Walton Magistrates Court, the Harrisons pleaded guilty to unlawful possession of cannabis resin. Prosecutor Michael West said that the couple had been of impeccable character heretofore. He also told the magistrate it is infrequent to find quite as much of the drug as one found in this case. There's something like 570 grains, which would result when used in a large number of cigarettes. It would be wrong to draw the inference, however, that there was any intention to sell them. It was quite clear in the evidence that this was for personal consumption only, no more than a private supply. The Harrisons' barrister, Martin Polden, pointed out that Patty had allowed the police to go everywhere they wanted without obstruction and had made no attempt to hide the box on the living room table found to contain nearly 500 grains of hashish. Polden also noted that the many powders, crystals, and jaw sticks which the police had taken an interest in were all quite harmless and only emphasized the Harrisons' well-known interest in yoga. Of the drugs subsequently found by the police in the Harrisons' wardrobe, he said, "The couple cannot explain this find. They know nothing about it to this day. The large amount of cannabis found, however, does not indicate that theirs is a household of corruption and debauchery. There is no question of addiction." The magistrate fined Harrison and his wife £250 each, and awarded 10 guineas cost against each of them. The couple were allowed to keep an ornamental pipe confiscated in the raid. As he left the court, George noted to one of the reporters outside, "We hope that the police will now leave the Beatles alone." But it was not to be. It is interesting to note that in October of 1972, Sergeant Pilcher, the officer behind both the raid on Harrison and John Lennon earlier in 1968, was sentenced to several years in prison for planting drugs on an innocent suspect. Shortly after the bust, the couple began the laborious task of house hunting, aided by a mountain of illustrated real estate catalogs advertising some of Britain's finest properties. Perhaps the most outlandish tale regarding the Harrisons' desire to find themselves a home comes via Alistair Taylor, who tells of the time Patty appeared at Apple dressed as a dowdy upper-crust newlywed, expecting him to play the part of her husband on an all-day country outing in search of a suitable property. Once inside the limousine, Patty offhandedly introduced Alistair to James, their uniformed chauffeur for the afternoon. "Where to, old boy?" the driver asked, turning to Alistair. "Good Lord, George, it's you," Alistair cried. "What's going on?" "Well," Harrison jokingly explained, "you're the one who's always saying that everyone's out to screw the Beatles, so we decided to let you be the buyer this afternoon." Motoring their way from one palatial country estate to the next, Patty and Alistair played the part to a T. George and Patty's attempt at anonymity, however, was short-lived. At one of their last stops, an impressive Georgian estate just outside of London, the agent casually inquired if Mr. Harrison out in the car might like to come in and look around as well. All George and Patty could do was laugh. The Beatles' ever-expanding celebrity, it seemed, was bigger than the both of them. Chapter 5. Eye of the Needle, Apple, Acid, and the End of the Beatles. Listen, man, the Beatles were really breaking up from about day one. More than once in the early days I had to go out and find George. He'd just say, "I'm not doing this anymore," and he'd piss off. I think the pressures got so bad towards the end I'm astonished that they even stayed together as long as they did. Alistair Taylor, longtime Beatles aide. Back in the late 60s, while many of the world's youth were busy getting loaded with their friends and living off student loans, George Harrison had already taken on a world of responsibility. He became one-fourth of the Beatles' International Apple Corps Limited, as well as being a full-time professional musician, composer, record producer, and husband. During this period, Harrison was now determined to forge a more meaningful role for himself within the group. Notwithstanding the Beatles' musical Midas touch, George became keen to launch his own solo career as well. To a lot of people, the very idea of corporate Beatles was a contradiction in terms. After all, these four young men were the gurus of a generation, jubilant harbingers of a new age centered on music, love, and a freer, less covetous lifestyle. What then would be their next trend-setting fashion statement? Bowler hats? "I just got back from the Maharishi's retreat in India a bit later than everybody else," George recalled in the mid-70s. "They all split and started Apple. When I got back, it was like a madhouse. In fact, to this day, we're still trying to untangle it. At that time, John and Yoko had just gotten together, and they had some guy throwing the I Ching every 10 minutes. 'Oh, we're having a business meeting. Let's play the I Ching.' The place was full of lunatics." Apple Corps Limited was established late in 1967, chiefly as a device for lessening the Beatles' incredible tax burden. Paul McCartney came up with the name after apparently being inspired by an original Magritte painting he owned, which featured a giant Granny Smith apple locked inside a tiny room. The Beatles, like most successful entertainers in Britain, took a hiding when it came to taxes. Clearly, both personally and collectively, something had to be done. Apple, it now seems, was very much the inevitable outcome of an extremely difficult dilemma. Where should the Beatles put their ever-expanding millions? Despite Brian Epstein's well-known knack for packaging and promotion, his business sense was poor. He often worked with cash, lots of it, which of course made it extremely difficult to balance the books at the end of the day. "The aim of Apple isn't really a stack of gold teeth in the bank," said John at a 1968 press conference in New York. "We've done that bit." The first Beatles-related venture to carry the Apple logo was the film Magical Mystery Tour, shown on English television on December 26, 1967. Artistically, it was years ahead of its time, employing many of the same surreal techniques so popular in today's rock videos. Commercially, however, it was a disaster. From there, Apple evolved into a trendy high-fashion head shop and boutique housed at 94 Baker Street in Sherlock Holmes territory, with a small music publishing division housed above the store. In those days, Mike Berry, the middle management music executive, and Beatle buddy Terry Duran were running the show, assisted by two attractive but largely ineffectual secretaries. A lot of dope was smoked and big ideas tossed back and forth, but precious little was accomplished. And with the Beatles backing the venture to the halt, expenses tended to run rather high. Compared with what was happening downstairs, though, Apple Publishing was a veritable model of corporate efficiency. The Apple Boutique opened its doors on December 7, 1967, with a gala celebration attended by John, George, their wives, and about 200 more trendy people than could comfortably fit in the store. John nicknamed it a psychedelic Woolworths, and almost immediately it became the place to see and be seen in swinging London. The shopfront featured a far-out, acid-inspired mural by a team of Dutch designers who called themselves the Fool. After endearing themselves to the Beatles, the flamboyant artists proceeded to put their creative touch on just about everything the boys owned. Suddenly, their wild rainbow-colored designs showed up on George's living room fireplace and on one or two of his favorite guitars. John even commissioned a fancy paint job for an antique upright piano. However impressed the Beatles might have been with the Fool's far-out creations, their Baker Street neighbors were less favorably disposed and promptly petitioned city officials to have the offending dreamscape removed from the building. About 8 months later, the shop was closed down after a long history of petty pilfering and poor management, and the entire contents given away free to the public. That is, after the boys stopped by to do a little last-minute shopping themselves. By February of 1968, Apple Corps had outgrown its Baker Street digs and moved to an entire floor of a smart office building at 95 Wigmore Street. But within a few months, even these offices proved too small for the Beatles' ever-growing empire, and on June 22, the London papers reported that Apple had purchased number 3 Savile Row for more than £500,000. Known the world over as London's preeminent tailoring strip, Savile Row didn't exactly embrace the Beatles and company when they heard the news. They knew that where the Beatles went, their fans would surely follow, an unsettling thought for an industry to whom very proper appearances were so very important. Artistically, Apple was always a very mixed bag. At one end of the spectrum, such artists as the Radhakrishna Temple, soul singer Doris Troy, and Jackie Lomax may have been somewhat out of the mainstream, but nevertheless meant a lot to George. As a musician, Harrison was inventive and ever willing to experiment with new sounds. A self-confessed perfectionist, he would often lose himself in his work, going over and over the same riff until he got it just right. And as a producer, his job demanded that he oversee virtually every detail of the often laborious recording process. If nothing else, George Harrison is an honest man, sometimes painfully so. Several years after Apple's demise, he had this to say about the ill-fated company. "It wasn't me who wanted to do Apple. Paul decided to do Apple, and it was aided and abetted by John. Of course it was a good idea, but it wasn't subtle enough. Shouting to everybody about what you're going to do before you even know what you're going to do yourself is just stupid. Yes, I loved it because it was what we wanted to do and what I'm still trying to do in a way." While Harrison might have been reserved when it came to pushing himself to the fore creatively, he had no such inhibitions when it came to climbing behind the wheel of a good fast car. Throughout the years 1966 to 1969, George Harrison struggled with an on-again, off-again drug problem that included an array of non-addictive substances such as LSD, mescaline, peyote, psilocybin, marijuana, and hashish. John Lennon has admitted that both he and George were pretty heavy on acid. "We probably are the most cracked," he has said, Paul being a bit more stable than George and I. To his credit, however, George never got involved with hard drugs like heroin or morphine. A deeply ingrained fear of needles helped, but beyond that, he had seen too many good friends become hopelessly addicted or end up dead to take that risk himself. As with most things in George Harrison's life, there was method behind the drug-taking. Unlike the youth of today who seem intent on using drugs to numb themselves to the reality of life around them, the youth of the 60s considered dropping acid as a key to inner knowledge and heightened self-awareness. Their drug-taking, then, was not necessarily an escape from anything, but often an attempt to reach a subtler, more meaningful reality. "LSD was just like lots of doors in my mind were flying open," said George at the time, and he meant it. Aided and abetted by such vocal advocates as former Harvard professor Dr. Timothy Leary and longtime advocate Dr. Richard Alpert, later to become Baba Ram Dass, many of the Beatles' generation were convinced that pharmacological nirvana was not only the surest means to tune in to this elusive higher consciousness, but without doubt most vividly colorful. George has said of the mysterious drug LSD, "It can help you get from A to B. But when you get to B, you see C. And you see that to get really high, you have to go it straight." This was the disappointing thing about LSD. In the physical world we live in, there's always duality, good and bad, black and white, yes and no. There's always something equal and opposite to everything, and that is why you can't say LSD is good or bad, because it's both good and bad. It's both of them, and it's neither of them altogether. People don't consider that. We've all got the same goal, whether we realize it or not. We're all striving for something called God. Everyone is a potential Jesus Christ, really. We're all trying to get where Jesus got, and we're going to be in this world until we get there. The hippies are a very good idea. Love flowers and all that is great, but when you see the other half of it, it's like anything. Look, I love all of these people too, who are honest and trying to find a bit of truth and to straighten out the untruth. I'm with them 100%, but when I see the bad side of it, I'm not so happy. Like the sweet swirling smoke of an Indian joss stick, the swinging 60s faded into the uncertain 70s and scattered to ashes any hopes the world might have had that the Beatles would stay together. When at last it came on December 31st, 1970, with the lawsuit McCartney brought against his three former partners, the end was long overdue. In even the most bitter of marriages, the mechanics of the final dissolution are always painful. Anger is the first emotion to be overcome, and in the case of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, that alone took years. Being in the Beatles, in Harrison's words to me, was like being in a box. And once the way was finally made clear, he ran like blazes and never looked back. Although they are all genuinely loving, none of the Beatles is particularly sentimental or nostalgic. On the surface, at least, there is a kind of hardness that probably owes much to being from the north of England, but even more of having lived through the lunacy of Beatlemania. When they went their separate ways, George was only too pleased to try and deflate the group's mighty myth at every turn. As a roving one-man anti-Beatles propaganda machine, George had a mighty tough row to hoe. Still, he makes a lot of sense. Look, even if I were to be a Beatle for the rest of my life, it would still only be a temporary thing, he says, referring to the transitory nature of life itself. As the years slipped away, however, Harrison's hardline view on the Fab Four loosened up considerably. Maybe one day we'll get the Beatles together and just have them in a room having tea. We'll satellite it all over the world and charge $20 each to watch it. We could make a fortune. By the mid-1970s, Harrison was able to see the whole amazing period with at least a measure of good humor. Chapter 6. Deep Pearl Rising, A Spiritual Journey. I am all-devouring death, and I am the generator of all things yet to be. Among women I am fame, fortune, speech, memory, intelligence, faithfulness, and patience. I am also the gambling of cheats. And of the splendid I am the splendor, I am victory, I am adventure, and I am the strength of the strong. Sri Krishna, from the Bhagavad Gita as it is. Ever since George Harrison was a little boy, he suspected that there might be a God. Once, while deep in meditation at the Maharishi's Rishikesh ashram, he experienced what he called a slowing down of the thought process, followed by a blinding acceleration of consciousness. It was frightening, says Harrison, but it was nothing new. As a child, he had often felt the same thing, only then he was terrified, as he had absolutely no idea what it meant. Years later, he could understand it as a lightning flash of divine awareness. It's something to do with feeling really tiny, says George, but at the same time, I also felt I was a whole thing as well. It was like being two completely different things at the same time. Soon that feeling would begin to vibrate right through me and started getting bigger and faster and faster. Before I knew what was happening, it was going so far and so fast it was mind-boggling, and I'd come out of it really scared. I used to get that experience a lot when recording at Abbey Road. I'd go into this big empty studio, get into a sound box and do my meditation. It was here I had a couple of indications that this was the same thing that I felt as a kid. After the party was well and truly over, the brain drain of having been a Beatle 24 hours a day was overwhelming. Shell-shocked by a whirlwind celebrity that never subsided, the four were compelled to find other outlets or fizzle away. John eventually collided head-on with Yoko Ono, Paul with his solo career, Ringo with acting, and George with himself. It is said in the Vedas, the sacred Hindu text, that whatever a great man shall attempt, common men will follow. Harrison's well-publicized spiritual trek to India became a catalyst for a lot of people's own inward journey. Once again, the Beatles led the way. The first time I heard Indian music, George recalled in 1967, I felt as though I knew it. It was everything I could think of. It was like every music I had ever heard, but 20 times better than everything all put together. It was just so strong. So overwhelmingly positive, it buzzed me right out of my brain. From the first eerie twang of the Indian sitar in the motion picture soundtrack of the Beatles' second feature, Help, George Harrison was forever hooked. From that moment on, all things Hindu, philosophy, diet, fashion, literature, and art held their transcendental sway over the young devotee. Suddenly, in tiny bedrooms and cluttered crash pads around the world, young people were ripping down their tattered M.C. Escher posters in favor of brightly colored representations of an array of multicolored benevolent gods from Buddha to Rama. And at the very hub of this spiritual revolution was George's friend and mentor, sitar virtuoso Ravi Shankar. I met him at Peter Sellers' house in London for dinner, recalled George, of their introduction in 1966, and he offered to give me some instruction on the basics of the sitar. It was the first time I'd ever actually approached music with a bit of discipline. Later, I started really listening to Indian music, and for the next 2 years, I hardly even touched the guitar, except for recording. Having all these material things, I still wanted something more, and it suddenly all came to me in the form of Ravi Shankar. In the early summer of 1966, George humbly requested that Shankar accept him as a student or shishya. It was a challenging undertaking, but he applied himself admirably and came away with a newfound knowledge and respect for Hindu culture. The Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was the first real spiritual master most of us had ever seen, and he fit the bill as a Hollywood-style Indian guru to a T. Long, stringy, shoulder-length hair, salt and pepper beard, flowing robes, and that laugh. If nothing else, his cosmic cackle was worth the price of admission. Those who became enamored of the Maharishi's 15-minute-a-day meditation were adamant that whatever it was you wanted out of life, TM or transcendental meditation could and most definitely would enhance your chances of getting it. By the late summer of 1967, both George and Petty Harrison had become absorbed in cultivating their spiritual lives. They had already endeavored to teach themselves meditation from books, but they weren't really making much headway. So when a girlfriend of Patty's suggested that she attend a lecture on transcendental meditation at Caxton Hall, London, she readily accepted and afterward signed up to become a member. George, meanwhile, alerted the other Beatles that the Maharishi was coming to London and that they could hear him speak at the Hilton Hotel on August 24. They went and were impressed by what they heard. Afterwards, the Maharishi met the boys and invited them to a 10-day conference in Bangor, North Wales, the next day. Traveling with the Guru by train on the mystical special, as the London Daily Mirror called it, were Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, and Patty's younger sister, Jenny Boyd, among others. George especially was genuinely excited with the prospect of finally hooking up with someone who, it seemed, might be able to provide some answers to the Beatles' non-stop, topsy-turvy existence. Naturally, the platform at Bangor was mobbed by hundreds of screaming fans. John Lennon later confided that the naive yogi actually thought the crowds had turned out to see him. On August 27, 1967, the Beatles were formally initiated into his society. But just then, some distressing news suddenly came in from London. Brian Epstein was dead. Although the Beatles were naturally concerned about how Epstein's untimely demise might affect their careers and thus their staggering collective fortunes, for George Harrison, the tragedy only encouraged his further retreat into the yogic philosophy that by now consumed him. It was therefore with great enthusiasm and optimism all around that George, John, their wives, and a few close friends arrived at New Delhi Airport on the morning of February 16, 1968, to begin serious study with the Maharishi at his extravagant Rishikesh retreat. At the end of a rugged 150-mile drive in 3 cars from New Delhi to the ashram, the celebrated disciples were warmly welcomed by the diminutive guru with a shower of encouraging words and endless cups of steaming tea on the veranda of his comfortable stone bungalow situated in the heart of the rambling camp. Mal Evans gives us a hint of the many amenities available to the meditators in an article first published in the Beatles Monthly book in May of 1968. I suppose a total of about 40 people were employed at the Academy, he says, including joiners of full-scale printing works, numerous cooks, and cleaning staff. The room service was marvelous. On my first day there, I unpacked dozens of the Beatles shirts and other clothing and piled them up on the shelves in my rooms. An hour later, the lot had disappeared. That same evening, they were all back, freshly washed and pressed, and I hadn't even asked. As one day slipped casually into the next, and the initial excitement of the trip subsided, the boys' pent-up tensions slowly began to unravel under the magic spell of the meditation. Most days it was the normally sluggish John who was up first, and after about a half an hour of meditation, he would go for a leisurely stroll around the compound with Mal or George. The Maharishi really was a wonderful teacher, recalls Cynthia. His lectures and talks were humorous, enlightening, and provided truly halcyon days for John and George particularly, who were in their element. But in the end, however, there were rumors that the Maharishi had made an advance for the earthly affections of fellow meditator Mia Farrow, and the party was over. The Beatles stormed out of the bungalow and rang for a taxi from the ashram's dining hall before racing back to their quarters to pack. As they were filing out the main gate, a disciple was sent by the Maharishi to make one last painful, pitiful plea for them to calm down and talk things over. But it was too late. The Beatles, like so many times in the past, had burned their bridges and they were moving on. As Paul's brother Mike McCartney has said, "With that lot, you only get one chance and then you're finished." Within 36 hours, the Harrisons and the Lennons were safely back home on their estates in suburban London. The magical Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, for all the promise, goodwill, and great vibrations, had become just another in a long series of bum trips. Shyama-Sundar Das, a broad-shouldered, strapping young American devotee of Krishna, sat patiently in Apple's crowded reception area, quietly fingering his prayer beads, awaiting a precious moment or two with George Harrison. In any ordinary business, the sight of a saffron-robed, shaven-headed Hindu monk tapping out mantras in the lobby might have at least raised an eyebrow, but this was Apple circa 1969, the hip center of the hippie world, and nothing was too far out. Nor was this even the Hare Krishna's first overture to the ascetically inclined Harrison. Ever since the first feeble wave of devotees shuttled across the Atlantic from America the year before, they, like most of the world's youth, had Beatles on the brain. Still, this was no ordinary teenage hero worship. The devotees shared a serious, single-minded devotion to the Lord Sri Krishna, and as such felt it imperative to try and link up with a celebrity of global stature like George. Earlier attempts at attracting the attention of the Beatles had included sending them an apple pie with the words Hare Krishna scrolled across the top and green icing, as well as dropping off an inscribed wind-up walking apple and a homemade audition tape of their hypnotic Vedic chants. For this particular offering, they received the standard Apple Records rejection letter. Bounding down the stairs from a late afternoon conference, George stopped dead in his tracks upon seeing the yogi. Bounding down the stairs from a late afternoon conference, George stopped dead in his tracks upon seeing the yogi. "Where have you lot been?" he called out excitedly, making his way through the crowded room. "I've been trying to connect up with you people for some time. It's great to finally see you." For the next 2 hours, George and Shyama-Sundar sat talking, completely oblivious to the dozen or so hangers-on crowding around this transcendental odd couple. As he rose to leave, George invited all of the devotees to his Esher bungalow the next afternoon for lunch with his mates John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Racing back to the dilapidated headquarters of the London Radha Krishna Temple in an old warehouse in Covent Garden, Shyama-Sundar was ecstatic with the hope that the movement would now begin to take hold in Great Britain. After all, with the Beatles' good wishes and the blessings of Krishna, nothing was impossible. The next day, the devotees, complete with flowing robes, cymbals, tambourines, and Indian drums, boarded London's public transport, bound for Waterloo Station and then the wilds of Esher. After a hearty vegetarian smorgasbord and a brief chanting session, everyone settled down to a friendly chat. "Hey, why the robes and that?" wondered Lennon. "This is not that culture. Won't you tend to turn off more people than you attract?" "Why compromise?" countered George. "There's no reason for them to try and fit in with everyone else. Besides, yogis have dressed this way for thousands of years." Shyama-Sundar remembers feeling really warm towards not only his host, but the other Beatles as well. "They were really very nice people," he commented years later, "but George was always the one who was really sincere about trying to know God. This wasn't just a casual sort of curious intellectual inquiry, but rather a deep, deep longing for the truth." As the weeks passed, George and Shyama-Sundar became increasingly close. George also formed friendly relationships with 2 other devotees, Mukunda and Guru Das. "I feel at home with Krishna," says George. "I think that's something that's been there from a previous birth." So it was like a door opening at the time, but it was also like a jigsaw puzzle, and I needed all these pieces to help make the complete picture. And yes, those are just some of the reasons why I responded to Shyama-Sundar and Guru Das when they first came to London. Mukunda Das Goswami, a longtime associate of Harrison's and today the head of ISKCON's Public Affairs Office in San Diego, remembers those early sessions at George's place in 1969. "The first time we got together to record was at George's place on Claremont Drive in Esher. He had a very nice vegetarian meal prepared, and afterwards we all chanted with him and Billy Preston. Billy was playing an early type of Moog synthesizer, George was playing his guitar, and we were on drums and kartals, hand cymbals. I remember us doing a bit of cooking together that night, and I think he may have even played us a Lenny Bruce record. Later that same week, the devotees joined Harrison and Preston yet again for another preparatory session for their recording work, this time at Trident Studios in St. Anne's Alley, a particularly seamy section of Soho's notorious red light district. Once again, George and the devotees went through their repertoire of up-tempo Sanskrit chants, and when it was over, Harrison and Shyama-Sundar both felt the time was right for what they called a real session. On the appointed day, the devotees assembled at EMI Abbey Road Studios in St. John's Wood. When the first group of devotees arrived in George's white Mercedes, a crowd of teenagers began singing Hare Krishna to the tune popularized by the rock musical Hair. While Yamuna applied Vaishnava tilak to the foreheads of the recording technicians, Malati began unpacking the picnic baskets of prasadam, vegetarian foodstuffs first offered to Krishna, which she had brought, while some of the other devotees put up pictures of Krishna and lit incense. Abbey Road Studios was now Krishnaized. With Paul McCartney and his wife Linda operating the control console, the recording session began. Everyone worked quickly, making side 1 of the 45 RPM in about an hour. George played organ, and Mukunda played mridangam, an Indian drum. Yamuna sang the lead with Shyama-Sundar backing her, with other voices blending together in a wonderful chorus. On the fourth take, everything went smoothly, with Malati spontaneously hitting a brass gong at the very end. Then they recorded the flip side of the record. Afterwards, George dubbed in the bass, guitar, and other voices. The devotees, engineers, and everyone felt great about it. This is going to be big, George promised. By now, officially signed to Apple Records as a recording act promoted under the name of the Radha Krishna Temple, the devotees finally felt they were on their way. Around this time, Apple Records released the devotees' first single, the Hare Krishna Mantra, with prayers to the spiritual master on the B-side. Apple staged a launch party in the back garden of a large Georgian mansion in South London. An impressive blue and white striped tent was erected, under which London's top media types enjoyed a gourmet vegetarian meal, as well as a rousing chanting session with George and the devotees. Beatle confidant Peter Brown witnessed firsthand Harrison's conversion to Krishna consciousness, but is skeptical about its lasting effect on the singer. Yes, I think he was sincere all right, but I don't really feel they changed him one whit. When George got on to any subject he was involved in, he became a little boring. He's one of those people who, when he's telling you about something, just doesn't know when to stop. He goes on and on. Whether he's talking about transcendental meditation, Hare Krishna, or whatever, it's the same. He just goes on. I'm sure he genuinely believes in the philosophy, but that doesn't mean he's going to always practice what he's preaching. I mean, you can talk to a good Catholic and they know what they want to do, but what they actually achieve is something slightly different. It is to George Harrison's great credit that he has shown himself to be liberal and generous enough to have embraced the teachings of so many seasoned and enlightened masters over the years. Of them, 3 present perhaps the greatest challenge to our understanding. Paramahansa Yogananda, long recognized as a sincere and highly evolved advocate of the science of Kriya Yoga, is to many the quintessential spiritual guide. Throughout his brief lifetime, he traveled the world extensively, teaching its precepts and along the way establishing the Self-Realization Fellowship, or SRF. Perhaps his most significant achievement, however, was authoring the widely read Autobiography of a Yogi, an introspective look at the incredible life of one who has traveled far along the often perilous spiritual path. Ever since George first received a copy from a friend in 1966, it has seldom left his side. When his mother was dying of cancer in a Liverpool hospital, George used to sit by her bedside reading the insightful book out loud. He has often described it as saying it has a miracle on every page. Even today, Harrison routinely presents lavish, leather-bound, inscribed copies to all of his associates, carefully drawing his signature Om sign just below his name. Strangely, Harrison rarely discusses his great affection for the Guru. It is perhaps a measure of his genuine regard for the Master that through his music he regularly comes out with passing references to Yogananda's teaching. That said, he has never really publicized his association with the SRF. He did, however, have this to say in the late 70s. Yogananda in 1952, as opposed to dying, left his body, and he's been probably the greatest inspiration to me. Yogananda I never met personally in this body, but he has had such a terrific influence on me for some very subtle reason. I can't quite put my finger on it. A lot of my feelings are the result of what he taught and is still teaching in the subtle state. The second of the masters, Satya Sai Baba, the alleged reincarnation of the well-known Hindu saint Sai Baba, is a different matter altogether. Highly controversial, but still immensely popular with Indians around the globe, he claims to have attained the same level of consciousness as Christ. That is, he says he is an avatar, or the divine prophet of God for our time. As in the case of Jesus, there is also a body of rather convincing evidence that over the years he has performed numerous miracles, from producing jewelries and sacred ash out of thin air to healing the sick, reading minds, and allegedly even raising the dead. Very little is known about George Harrison's connection to Sai Baba. Most Harrison observers first became aware of the former Beatles' interest after seeing George wearing a Sai Baba button on the inside cover of his 33 1/3 LP. It is believed that the Guru once granted Harrison a rare personal audience at his ashram in India sometime in the mid-70s. John and Yoko also met Sai Baba around this time. It was from this experience that Lennon later made the quizzical comment, "Guru is the pop star of India. Pop stars are the gurus of the West." Finally, young Guru Maharaji may also claim some allegiance from Harrison. George's second wife, Olivia, reportedly introduced him to the corpulent teenage guru sometime in the mid-70s, and Harrison rapidly became intrigued with the philosophy and meditational techniques of his divine light mission. Although never a serious disciple, Harrison was sufficiently impressed with the master that he signed several of his followers to his Dark Horse label under the name of Jiva. They recorded just one album, Jiva, and then dropped from sight. The road to hell, they say, is straight and broad. The road to heaven, however, is narrow, rough, and treacherous. One is easy, the other difficult. George Harrison's arduous spiritual trek was fraught with disappointment and pain from the beginning. In 1967, after finally coming to grips with the tug of his inner voice, George Harrison began a frantic search for someone or something that could help him on his way. "I used to laugh when I read about Cliff Richard being a Christian," Harrison has said in the Beatles, the authorized biography. "I still cringe when I hear about it, but I know now that religion and God are the only things that exist. I know some people think I'm a nutcase. I find it hard not to myself sometimes, because I still see so many things in an ordinary way. But I know that when you believe, everything is real and nice. Not believing is all confusion and emptiness." Chapter 7. Sir Frank of Paradise Road, Finding a Home. It is impossible to imagine George without Friar Park and vice versa. As far as he's concerned, we Harrisons are little more than caretakers. To George, the park will always belong strictly to old Sir Frank. Harry Harrison. A bizarre folly in its own grounds behind Town Hall. Friar Park, as described in Buildings of England, 1920. Even the most cursory look at the life and times of George Harrison must try to unknot the riddle of his unswerving devotion to Sir Frank Crisp and Friar Park. It is difficult to imagine how he feels about the place, having come himself from such humble beginnings. 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down was all we ever had, he once told his chum Robbie Kane. Yet today he reigns as the great estate's second eccentric lord. Once more, George has submitted himself to yet another albeit unlikely guru. "Sir Frank helped my awareness," says Harrison. "Whatever it was I felt became stronger, or found more expression by moving into that house. Everything stepped up, or was heightened significantly. Sir Frank Crisp, millionaire London solicitor and well-respected Oxfordshire Justice of the Peace, wrangled the sale of Friar Park from a Henley clergyman, the Reverend J. Collard, in 1899. A massive manor house on Paradise Road on the outskirts of Henley, Friar Park sat like a great sparkling diamond in the rough amidst acres of rambling grounds. Crisp's first order of business was to pull down all but a few of the original walls and start over. With the help of noted architect M. Clark Edwards, Sir Frank began the laborious task of creating his very own quasi-Gothic Disneyland. The decorative theme of Frank's Folly, as some of Crisp's more conservative neighbors insisted on calling the mammoth project, reflects its original residents, humble friars. Friars, reasoned the philosophically inclined solicitor, must be the hallmark of this house, God's most simple and yet keenly intellectual and spiritual of beings, forsaking the push and shove of the world in search of a deeper understanding, the ordinary man's most tangible link to the great unseen. When the imposing stone manor house was nearly completed, Sir Frank went to work counseling sculptor T. Richardson on his vision of the park's unique statuary. The result, a grotesquely beautiful array of stone gargoyles, statues of whimsical monks, and quirky religious sayings carved over doors and windows, was beyond even Sir Frank's expectations. In his only known work, The Friar Park Guide, Crisp gives us a glimpse of the unique variety of stonework to be found on the property. The heads of two grave and gay friars cap the inner pillars of the lower gates. The latter has a bloated and sensual face, while the former is thoughtful and intellectual. Over the porch of the lodge is a representation of a fox in the cowl and gown of a friar preaching. The hypocritical fox-turned-ecclesiast is preying upon his congregation. The leering friar, who is looking round the corner on the north side of the house with a broad grin in his face, is supposed to be watching the passing of the remains of the proprietor, and chuckling to himself, "There are no more footsteps backwards for you." Over the scullery is a kitchen friar engaged in washing up dishes, flanked by a pair of skulls on one side and a skull and crossbones on the other. Over the kitchen window is the culinary proverb, "God sends the meat, but the devil sends the cook." The veranda has representations of the Friars of the Winds, the North Wind friar with puffed-out cheeks as befits its blustery nature, the East Wind with thin cheeks, representing its piercing character, the West Wind tearful and watery, and the South Wind with a smiling, sunny face. Perhaps the most amusing of all the park's many carved friars is one terribly dour old acolyte stationed just outside the main entrance, holding a battered frying pan and caption, "Two Holy Friars." Harrison was so captivated by this particular creation that he chose it to adorn the inside bifold cover of his 33 1/3 LP. In addition to creating the estate's eye-popping statuary, Sir Frank saw fit to integrate his own peculiar philosophical statement inside the great house as well. He described the eccentric decor of his home in the Friar Park Guide. Friars are met with throughout the interior. Thus the switches of the electric lights are the movable noses of friars, which turn down and up as required. Friars also hold the electrical lamps at various points. The capitals of the pillars supporting the hall show friars engaged in sleeping, dreaming, snoring, yawning, and walking. There are friars with ordinary faces on one side and skulls on the other. Friars drinking, friars cooking, in fact, friars in all profusion that any lover of friars could ever wish. In addition, a wry collection of what Crisp called perverted proverbs also decorate the interior of the manor house. Although mostly inscribed in Latin, Sir Frank's indomitable wit comes shining through in these original quirky lines. The guide supplies a few examples. People who live in glass houses should dress in the dark. A bird in the bush is worth two in the bonnet. Punctuality is the thief of time. A rolling stone waits for no man. It took a devoted team of local nurserymen more than 20 years to execute Sir Frank's grandiose plans for the acres of rolling gardens. Like his modern-day counterpart George Harrison, Frank enjoyed an enduring love of flowering plants and shrubs. In the August 5, 1905 edition of Country Life magazine, Friar Park's well-tended gardens were described as a beautiful little paradise of flowers nestled round one of the most pleasant homes in Oxfordshire. Further, there is a superb topiary garden, charmingly natural colonies of old-fashioned flowers in the Elizabethan garden, walks of rambling roses, rosemary, and lavender to give effect in gray and shades of crimson and purple from choice grounds of Japanese maples. Many profitable hours may be spent with Mr. Crisp in studying the rare collections which abound all over this unusual estate. The property also featured many rare species of trees and flowers. One of a number of unusual attractions is a miniature Matterhorn, a mountain Crisp had always particularly admired, made of 20,000 tons of gravel. Sir Frank also had his very own caves constructed underneath the house. To make them even more exciting, he had them flooded so that they could be enjoyed by boat, visitors therefore not having to exert themselves by a strenuous hike. Crisp loved taking his guest on an after-dinner cruise to the wonder of his stalactite-covered caverns bathed in colored light. In his 1981 book, The Beatles After the Beatles, John Blake provided a rare description of Sir Frank's fantasy caverns. Each cave had its own extraordinary character. The skeleton cave contained countless skeletons and distorting mirrors. The vine cave, huge bunches of illuminated glass grapes. The gnome cave was filled with more gnomes than a row of Surbiton gardens. Sir Frank's favorite cave, however, was the big cave, where he had a wishing well installed. While one looked down, a servant swiveled a handle until 4 heads appeared in turn, 2 men and 2 women, from whom one could choose his or her future sweethearts. In the early 1900s, Sir Frank was called an eccentric. Today he'd probably be chanting Hare Krishna and jetting back and forth to India. Crisp was a seeker, maybe even a seer. Is it any wonder that Harrison is so completely and inextricably captivated by the place? Friar Park is far more than stone and tiles, leaded glass and panoramic views. It is a signpost to the inner realm, rooted by its unusual founder in something far beyond the scope of this workaday world. Finally, it is old Sir Frank's own personal search, sculpted in stone and carved in the face of every one of the estate's guardian monks. Following Crisp's death in 1919, Friar Park was put up for sale by auction in 5 lots. Along with what a printed friar hawked as the estate's exceptional grounds and world-famous rock garden, went the well-appointed house with summer rooms and 3 grand residential sites, as well as the Oxford Lounge, the main house and the majority of Sir Frank's exquisite furnishings. By the early 1950s, the park was run as a convent, housing a strict order of Salesian Catholic nuns, who later turned it into a private school for young ladies. Kirsten Grepney, a former high-fashion model in London and later Legs Larry Smith erstwhile girlfriend, is an alumna of Friar Park School. She remembered her years there in a 1984 interview with this author. My school days at Friar Park were wonderful. There was always a keen sense of adventure since we were generally allowed to make good use of the extensive grounds and vast ornate buildings. We were often taken to play in the underground caves and went for long walks in the Swiss gardens. The main building was delightfully decorated with humorous gargoyles and jolly friar lights, which always amused me. Since the nuns were from a very strict Roman Catholic order, the resident Mother Superior had miniature underwear painted onto some of the many lusty cherubs who were showing just a little bit more than she felt they ought to for young ladies. Toward the end of the 60s, the sisters tried to keep the school going, but due to a lack of funds, it was ultimately closed. By this time, of course, the estate needed a lot of work, and the grounds in particular had become very run down. Everyone was thoroughly delighted, however, when we heard the news that George Harrison of the Beatles had purchased the property. It has now been beautifully restored and looks today, one suspects, very much as it did in old Sir Frank's time. After the decision was finally made to close the school, a group of local businessmen considered buying the estate with an eye to raising the manor and building a housing complex on the valuable real estate. Meanwhile, George and Patty had been house hunting for the past 2 years. Having outgrown their Esher bungalow, they were very anxious for the added privacy and spaciousness of the countryside. And if Patty were to become pregnant, it would be better for the baby, too. From the first day George saw Friar Park, he knew it must be his, despite the $336,000 price tag. If Brian Epstein had been alive, says George, I probably wouldn't have ended up in this house, because part of getting it meant that I was going beyond my means completely. Karmically, the only way I could have done this was to have a manager who was going beyond his means, too. It was in Alan Klein's interest to keep us happy. So in a way, he was doing the right thing. If I'd worried about whether or not to do it, well, I just wouldn't have. On moving day, a few of the old sisters were still in residence and became visibly upset at the sight of Friar Park's trendy new owners. One of George's first official acts as Lord of the Manor was to tack up over the ornate fireplace in the library an oversized poster of Lord Vishnu slumbering transcendently on the Garbhodakshai ocean of milk. "What on earth?" shrieked the nuns. "No, it's okay," George assured them. "God has many forms." When Harrison first bought the estate in March 1970, he had no idea of Sir Frank's underground fantasy caves or even the full extent of the park's original gardens. As George's friend Mukunda Goswami says, there turned out to be quite a few hidden treasures. After the nuns moved in, they covered a lot of the original stuff over. George actually excavated the whole thing after he found the plans to Friar Park. He discovered there was a whole waterfall system, underground caverns, and a lot of things that the nuns just didn't want, so they had them boarded up. George added to crisp eccentricities a few humble accoutrements of his own, including a luxury swimming pool, a heliport, tennis court, a rustic playhouse overlooking a beautiful glade, an ornate fountain dedicated to Lord Shiva, and most important of all, a state-of-the-art recording studio, says George. The studio was installed around 1971, but there's been a few updates over the years because originally it was just 16 tracks. After that time at Abbey Road EM Studios, I just wanted to be able to tumble out of bed and get straight to work. No more running a gauntlet of fans on the way in or paying by the hour. FPSHOT, Friar Park Studios, Henley-on-Thames, was important to my creativity because it was the first place I could really relax while recording. Originally Friar Park's upstairs ballroom, George's studio is an eclectic contrast of high-tech equipment set within an interior of polished wood and thick terracotta-colored carpets, decorated with several outrageously expensive Tiffany table lamps. A small bulletin board over the mixing console is crammed with snapshots of family and friends. Inside the control room door, a red and white sign reads simply, "Silence." George and Patty both loved the easy, laid-back lifestyle they had created for themselves at Friar Park. Long, lazy summer days were spent just soaking up the sun or strolling through their gardens with old friends like Peter Sellers or Eric Clapton. Often she and George would pop into the local florist to buy fresh-cut flowers or be seen walking hand in hand along Henley's exclusive shopping district. Sometimes the Harrisons were spotted drinking quietly with friends at such places as the Angel Inn or the Row Barge pub just off Paradise Road. On those rare occasions when they ate out, it was usually at one of the town's excellent Chinese or Indian restaurants. Only occasionally were they waylaid by Beatle fans. Privacy was crucial to George, but that didn't stop him from sometimes trying to make friends with the locals. Kirsten Grupney tells of her first encounter with the naturally reclusive Harrison. "I was just 16 and standing near the entrance to Friar Park, waiting for my father to pick me up after an outing in Henley. I soon became aware of a rustling in the bushes behind me, and suddenly, out of nowhere, pops up this exceedingly strange-looking fellow, wearing Wellington boots, an old brown felt hat with very, very long, stringy hair and beard. 'Are you waiting for a bus, love?' he said. 'No,' I replied. 'It's okay. I'm quite fine, thank you.' Grappling over the top of the park's stone wall, he then very politely asked if I'd fancy coming up to the house for a cup of tea. 'No, thank you very much,' I said, trying for some strange reason not to actually look at him. 'I'm waiting for my father.' 'Some other time, then,' he whispered, turning back to walk in through the main gate. Once inside, he quickly pivoted and carefully latched the front gates. 'First one, then the other. Otherwise the swans will run off,' he shouted. I didn't know what to say. Eventually, George's two brothers, Harry and Peter, moved in along with their families. Harry was installed as estate manager, and Peter put in charge of the park's 10 gardeners, plus one full-time botanist. "I hardly ever see George," said Peter to this author in the mid-1980s. "When we do talk, it's usually about the garden. He's a fanatic." Fanatic is right. Like old Sir Frank, George is wild about gardening. He usually helps his small army of gardeners plant about 45,000 bulbs each fall. Old Crisp could have done far worse than having George as the new custodian of Friar Park, Robbie Kane once commented. In a way, it's as if Sir Frank is still somehow there, quietly inspiring George how to look after the place. Once or twice he's even suggested that he's actually seen him, striding confidently down the stairs, dressed in a smoking jacket, puffing away on a big cigar, says Kane. At Friar Park, says Robbie, old Frank is everywhere. For the first time, George Harrison had managed a real life away from the Beatles and the non-stop grind of the music business. Often he would climb the 3 long flights of stairs into one of the park's rickety turrets to sit on the stone windowsill and meditate. So far above it all, he felt at last free and at peace. The silence around him broken only by birdsong and the rustle of the manor's many colorful flags flapping carelessly in the breeze. Here George found time to reflect on his astounding career, his music, and his marriage. Where was life taking him? Surely all this had happened for some good reason. Sometimes he seemed more powerful than a king, so full was he of optimism and hope for the future. Other times, however, deep down, he felt unworthy and weak. Often it was too much for him to bear. Harrison's high-profile success also brought with it the heavy burden of worry and stress. Although Friar Park and the otherworldly philosophy of Sir Frank clearly meant a great deal to him, it still wasn't enough. Deep inside remained an emptiness no amount of comfort or money could ever hope to fill.
Chapter 8. Spot the Loony. Flying Solo.
Patty was just trying to get George's attention to make him jealous.
The problem was that I soon fell madly in love with her. He'd been into meditation for so long, and yet he couldn't keep his wife. All she wanted was for him to say, "I love you." And all he was doing was meditating. Eric Clapton. As George Harrison sat serenely at the feet of the Maharishi at a transcendental meditation conference in Bangor, North Wales, many miles away in London, Brian Epstein was struggling through his final agonizing moments of life. Inside the Guru's comfortable, airy quarters at the local university, he spoke in glowing terms of the infinite possibilities of life lived in the fullness of cosmic consciousness. For Epstein, all such possibilities were now finished. He died a lonely victim of his own isolated lifestyle on August 27, 1967, and the Beatles were devastated. George Harrison's breakaway marathon 3-record set, All Things Must Pass, was released in November of 1970. In the United States, it steadily climbed to be number 1. Magically, it remained on the charts for an incredible 38 weeks. The album, with its haunting melodies and sweeping, majestic production, was the culmination of months of painstakingly hard work by Harrison and producer Phil Spector. Having been continually shortchanged as a Beatle, George Harrison had finally come into his own. Not only was the album a gripping musical masterpiece, but was also imbued with an important spiritual message. Inspired by Harrison's homespun philosophy, young people everywhere began looking inside themselves for their own answers. The album spawned 2 popular singles, What Is Life and the international hit, My Sweet Lord. Almost overnight, Hare Krishna became a household word, and George Harrison was elevated as a solo artist to superstar status. John Lennon, as ever, was unguardedly cynical. "I remember John was really negative at the time," George recalled. "I was away, and he came round to my house, and there was a friend of mine living there who was also a friend of John's. Lennon just saw the album cover and said, 'He must be fucking mad putting 3 records out. And look at the picture on the front. He looks like an asthmatic Leon Russell.'" There was a lot of negativity going down at the time. Happily, George's big gamble paid off in a big way. He was now a force to be reckoned with and permanently on his own. His next public venture, the humanitarian Concert for Bangladesh, showed the world that George Harrison was more than willing to go out on a limb for a cause in which he truly believed. It was the first example of the staggering philanthropic power of rock and roll. The historic concert was the benevolent precursor for events like Live Aid, the Prince's Trust annual shows, and the Amnesty International tours. Harrison and his three famous cohorts had already proved to everyone that rock had a mind. Now he would prove that it had a heart as well. The roster of musicians slated to appear at the great benefit read like a who's who of rock and roll. On drums were Ringo Starr and super session man Jim Keltner. Country rocker Leon Russell and Billy Preston took over on keyboards, while Eric Clapton, George Harrison, and Jesse Ed Davis looked after most of the guitar work. In addition, the well-known Apple band Badfinger provided vocal harmonies and strummed along on acoustic guitars. Klaus Voormann played bass, and Jim Horn, as his name implies, led the electrifying horn section. On the Indian side of things, Ravi Shankar was on hand with his sitar, accompanied by his ever-present tabla man, the portly Alaraka. But for the fans, other than George Harrison himself, the biggest star of the event was the reclusive Bob Dylan. The three-record soundtrack from the event, The Concert for Bangladesh, was released to the public on December 20, 1971, and immediately began selling very well. Manager Alan Klein, though, was having difficulties keeping the retail price consistently low, around $9, in an effort to maximize the number of copies sold to bring in more money for the refugees. Initially, demand for the lavishly packaged album was so high that some unscrupulous record stores were charging anywhere from $15 to $18 each, extra money that stayed with the retailers. To George, the charitable nature of the venture was almost lost. When all was said and done, the Concert for Bangladesh raised a little more than $15 million for the war-torn refugees. In that, and musically of course, it was an astounding success. It was around this time that George and Patty began to admit that their marriage was steadily heading for trouble. A few days before the concert, a pretty 20-year-old I'll call Marilyn was to find out firsthand just how bad things really were. I was basically just an intensely involved fan when George and I first met, though I tried very hard not to let him see it. I had been hanging around his hotel for days, hoping to meet up with him, when suddenly his dad Harry passed by and came back for a talk. For his age, Mr. Harrison was still very attractive, with his long silver hair and deep dark eyes. He was only recently widowed, but nevertheless was quite flirtatious. As we were standing in the lobby chatting, I told him how much I admired and cared for his son. He was charming. He listened intently as I went on and on about how I felt that beyond anyone else, George and I were meant to one day be together. "George is very, very difficult to get close to, you know," he said to me softly. "But I know what you mean. Next to you, I'm probably his number one fan." Sometime later, Mel Evans approached Marilyn and invited her up to George's room. An invitation she enthusiastically accepted. "Thanks, Mal," said George nonchalantly, as if the roadie had just delivered the evening paper. "We'll see you in the morning." Alone at last with the object of her deepest, most sexual fantasies, the terrified young woman was amazed to see George seem to be far more uptight and shy than she was. I remember thinking, my God, what's he got to feel weird about? After all, he's a Beatle. After a few minutes of strange small talk, Harrison made his move, and almost immediately the two were on the bed making love. By Marilyn's account, George was a strong, considerate lover, and after several high-intensity interludes, they both sank down into the huge bed, exhausted. He was very much into Krishna at the time, she remembers, and after a quick nap and a shower, he taught me how to chant. One funny thing I remember from that night was George going on about how much he disliked being pounced upon by all the kids outside the hotel, harassing him for photos and autographs. He never realized that my trusty brownie was stashed in my purse not 5 feet away. He also talked a good bit about the Beatles, spending hours telling me old stories about their early days on the road and in Hamburg. I didn't have the heart to tell him that virtually every novice Beatle fan already knew most of them by heart. After a while, Marilyn began to feel for some reason increasingly uncomfortable. She knew that she had to somehow make an excuse and get away from this painfully sad and lonely man. It's hard to explain, but I suddenly felt very awkward and out of place. As I was leaving, he kissed me softly and told me to be sure and hurry back. I guess maybe I just didn't want him to think that I was really that easy. I had to let him see that I was different from all the others and that I really did care. Despite that evening's rather abrupt end, Marilyn did see Harrison on several occasions. We were together at the record plant once while he was working on the tapes for the concert. Another night, we spent time at the official opening of Ringo's spaghetti western, Blind Man. Harrison's next solo release, the philosophical Living in the Material World of 1973, was his last major attempt to promote his Krishna beliefs in mass. Although many reviewers saw the album as somewhat self-indulgent and even maudlin, Harrison remained confident that those who truly needed would hear his God-centered message. Everybody else, as usual, would either just ignore the work or, worse, simply see it as an old Beatles' newest trick. By late 1971, Harrison's home life at Friar Park was beginning to seriously unravel. After 7 years of reasonably happy coexistence with Patty, their relationship was now in real trouble. Ironically, at the hub of their estrangement was their mutual interest in Hindu culture and philosophy. While intensely interested in yoga and all things Indian, Patty was admittedly not as committed to the faith as was George. For years now, Patty had sporadically meditated, was largely vegetarian, studied Indian dance, read volumes by George's favorite gurus, accompanied her husband on pilgrimage to India's holy places, and even occasionally chanted Hare Krishna on the prayer beads presented to her by Srila Prabhupada. However, she fell short of actually calling herself a devotee of Krishna. Harrison, on the other hand, was intensely dedicated. Rumor has it he even offered to surrender himself at the feet of Prabhupada by formally joining ISKCON. No, his beloved master and friend was quoted as saying, "You can do far more for Krishna right where you are." To Patty, one of the most troublesome tenets of Prabhupada's teaching was his strict ban on sex for pleasure. She just couldn't reconcile such an unyieldingly rigid attitude with the deep feelings of love she had for her husband. George, however, was convinced, at least philosophically, that until an individual had conquered the pleasures of the flesh, attaining true spiritual knowledge would remain just a distant dream. All this is not to say that George didn't love Patty. He did, intensely. But his fairly straight-laced Liverpool upbringing and his espousal of right-wing Hinduism had apparently molded his views on women and family life in some rather peculiar ways. Seeing the great hurt in his young wife, George made a concerted effort to try and make things better between the two of them. But it was not to last. Bored with life at the cloistered Friar Park, Patty defied George's wishes and resumed her modeling career, accepting an assignment from designer Ozzie Clark for a Chelsea fashion show. Soon after, Harrison left for India, where he spent several weeks touring various holy places, constantly chanting on his japa mala beads and visiting with several well-known spiritual masters. Thereafter, he returned home ready to resume his career and try and salvage his floundering marriage. But this time, it was too late. Patty, in desperation, had flown to Los Angeles in June 1974 and was staying with her sister Jenny and her husband Mick Fleetwood. Days later, she linked up with Eric Clapton in Miami, where he was recording his comeback hit album, 461 Ocean Boulevard. For the beautiful Patty, there was no looking back. Maybe at first she had seen Eric's longing for her as a means to lure George back from his often dour, otherworldly pursuits. But now her affection for the sensitive, caring Clapton was real. Their love sprang fully grown from the disappointment and loneliness each had carried with them for so long. With Patty's support, Clapton was finally able to control his addictions and began to work at a furious pace, picking up the pieces of his broken career. By the summer of 1974, he was once again enjoying huge international success with a string of popular albums and a sold-out comeback tour. Around this time, George Harrison had met 27-year-old Mexican-born Olivia Trinidad Arias, originally assistant in the merchandising department at A&M Records and later a secretary for Dark Horse Records. Deeply involved with setting up his new label, Harrison was often on the phone with the quiet, attractive Arias, discussing its day-to-day operations. Before long, he realized that his brief encounters with the accommodating, unspoiled young woman were the highlight of his day, and he began calling her all the way from Henley just to chat. Walking alone through the gardens of his estate, George found himself thinking about her more and more, and soon telephoned a friend in California to have her checked out. After so many years of having people come on to him for all the wrong reasons, the world-weary Harrison knew full well what a great catch he had become for any enterprising female looking for a stepping stone to the big time. Olivia, however, was found to have no ulterior motives for their telephone relationship, and George flew to Los Angeles to meet her face to face. It was indeed love at first sight, and from that moment on, the two similar-looking lovers were inseparable. Perhaps the best remembered event of 1974 for Harrison fans was his critically disastrous George Harrison and Friends World Tour, which kicked off in Vancouver, British Columbia on November 2. It included as a warm-up act a 16-piece Indian orchestra headed by Ravi Shankar. Working with Harrison and the Indian musicians was bassist Willie Weeks, Robin Ford on guitar, drummer Andy Newmark, percussionist Emil Richards, Billy Preston on keyboards, saxophonist Tom Scott, and Chuck Findley trumpet. Despite the heavy artillery, however, none of the extravagantly staged shows was particularly well received by either audiences or the music media. The complaints were numerous. First, a lot of fans were extremely disappointed that Harrison refused to perform any but 4 classic Beatle hits. Even then, in his new improved versions of In My Life, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, For You Blue, and Something, George had altered some of the lyrics to reflect his current outlook on the past. As if all this wasn't enough for one tour, there was also a lot of criticism leveled at the God-conscious guitarist to lighten up on the religious content of the shows. Not everyone, though, found Harrison's high-flown tirades objectionable. At the time, I was on retainer from Apple Corps to investigate the possible illegal taping of George's concerts and the bootlegging of the Beatles' marathon Let It Be sessions. Sent to the Atlanta show under the direction of Apple's Los Angeles attorney Bruce Graycal, I was making my way through a crowd of long-haired teenagers who were hanging around the arena's backstage entrance when I noticed a gaunt young man with a rather faraway look in his eyes, furiously but quietly chanting a mantra I couldn't quite make out. Dressed in the standard hippie-issue faded bell-bottom jeans, he also wore a long Indian kurta, over which was an old army jacket, plastered with Oms and other Hindu signs. I paused for a moment to say hello. Hare Krishna, I said, nodding my head slightly in respect. Screw you, man, replied the kid, suddenly ultra-aggressive. It's not Hare Krishna, it's Hari Harrison. And so it seems that the old dark horse had his devoted disciples as well. By the time his next album, 33 1/3, rolled around, it seemed that Harrison was squarely back on musical track. Behind the scenes, however, things were still fairly tangled up. Harrison had missed his July 26, 1976 deadline by 2 months, and when he finally arrived in L.A. to deliver the master tapes to A&M, he discovered that Jerry Moss was preparing to sue him for the delay, to the tune of a staggering $10 million. George's response was to ring the brass at Warner Brothers and offer the album to them on the condition that they immediately buy out his contract with A&M. Warner agreed and made plans to promptly release the LP. In appreciation, Harrison consented for the first time to actively promote the album by traveling with Olivia to several major American cities, meeting freely with the media at each stop. It was during this period that Harrison became prey for yet another predatory lawsuit, this time brought against him by the proprietors of Bright Tunes Music, who were alleging that George had lifted the tune for his My Sweet Lord from the Chiffons' He's So Fine, the 1963 classic to which they owned the rights. The controversial case went to court in January 1976 and garnered international headlines with each and every bump and grind of the slowly moving wheels of justice. Represented by an army of high-powered copyright lawyers, Harrison sat quietly in the crowded New York City courtroom as a barrage of nasty accusations flew back and forth. Although Harrison may not have been consciously aware of the distinct similarity between the two hit tunes, somewhere along the way, either he or Billy Preston inserted the critical 3 notes that later convinced District Judge Owen that George had indeed committed an act of plagiarism against Bright Tunes. While promoting 33 1/3, Harrison reflected on the controversy. I'd be willing every time I write a new song if somebody will have a computer and I can just go up to the thing and sing my new song into it and the computer will say, sorry, or yes, okay. I'm perfectly willing to do that because the last thing I want to do is keep spending the rest of my life in court or being faced with that problem. Once you get people thinking, oh, well, they beat Harrison on My Sweet Lord, let's sue, they can sue the world. It made me so paranoid about writing, and I thought, God, I don't even want to touch a guitar or the piano in case I'm touching someone else's note. Somebody might own that note, so you better watch out. The fact is, about the only good thing that came out of the Bright Tunes ordeal for Harrison was that it gave him the inspiration to compose this song, a biting satire of the whole sordid affair, and the biggest tune on 33 1/3. All in all, said a Warner Brothers official as this song started its steady climb up the American charts, Harrison picked a mighty tough way to get a hit record.
Chapter 9. Enter the Frenchman. Harrison Lost and Found. One time George and Olivia came over to my place, and after a very pleasant evening of just sitting around watching the telly and drinking a little red wine, he took me aside and said, "You know, Robbie, if you and I stay friends, you'll never have to really worry about anything again. I take care of my pals, believe me." "Look, George," I said, "can't you understand that perhaps anyone just likes you for you? I couldn't care less about your money or who you are." He said, "Yeah, great. He understood and appreciated it. But to be honest, something about the way he looked at me told me that either he didn't really believe it or worse, just couldn't comprehend anyone really able to treat him like an everyday person." Robbie Kane. George Harrison was at home in Henley-on-Thames on January 5th, 1976, when he received the news. Mal Evans, the Beatles' ever-faithful roadie and friend, was dead. Since the group split, Mal had been employed at various times by all the Fabs, but he worked the most for George. He had been at Bangladesh, overseeing the day-to-day goings-on at Friar Park for a time, and traveled to the States to assist on recording sessions. He was someone the inherently skeptical George could trust. When the Beatles' bubble finally burst in 1970, all four were financially set for life. Between record royalties, music publishing, and a galaxy of outside investments, there were no money worries. The same could not be said, however, for many of the people who had helped them make it. By late 1975, Evans was having a very rough time. With his marriage finished, Evans took refuge in Los Angeles, where he hoped to find work as a freelance record producer. Although only George Martin had spent more time in the studio assisting the Beatles in the production of their work, that didn't make Mal a musician, nor did it give him the meticulous skills necessary to be a successful producer. One would think that Evans, having worked so intimately with the greatest show business phenomena of our time, would have plenty of opportunities. But instead, after having been at the very pinnacle of the record industry for so long, he found everything that followed rather a giant step down. You just couldn't go from 15 years with the Beatles to working with basement bands from Encino. And if you're a proud a man as Mal Evans, you don't hit up your millionaire pals either. Had any of the Beatles known how perilously close he was to the edge, there is little doubt that someone would have come to his aid. But the great bear of a man didn't ask for help. Instead, he turned to pills and drink. Mal was then living with a woman and her daughter in a modest West Hollywood apartment. He was out of work, but still felt he had to play the big man any time one of his show business buddies happened to breeze through Los Angeles. People always looked to Mal for a party, a ride to the airport, or a night in the town, but no one bothered to make sure that he was all right. Surely the man once in charge of looking after all of them could see to himself. Despondent over the deteriorating relationship with his girlfriend and agonizing always over money, Evans barricaded himself in the bedroom of his apartment and threatened suicide. The young woman phoned the police, who dispatched several officers to the scene, although Mal's only weapon was an air pistol. It was enough to convince the police that Evans meant business. As the police burst in through the door, Mal turned and swung the harmless weapon in their direction. He was caught in the chest with a barrage of bullets and died instantly. That's one way to handle a suicide call, I guess. In the bitterest irony of all, back in the turbulent heyday of Beatlemania, Mal was made an honorary sheriff of Los Angeles County in recognition of his efforts in helping to keep the peace during the Beatles' fanatic assault on the City of Angels.
I was horrified when I heard about the accident, says Apple songstress Mary Hopkin. It was awful. I think it was unforgivable. They should have just shot him in the knees or something. They didn't have to kill him. He was the gentlest person I have ever known. My sister and I used to go out for drinks with him in the evening and to clubs. He was a darling. I got to know him and his family very well. When Mal died, the diaries he had kept religiously since first coming to work for the Beatles disappeared. In 1983, George Harrison hinted to me that even if they were found, due to legal entanglements, they would probably never be published. In the 1988 limited edition book Songs by George Harrison, George, with a little help from master illustrator Keith West, concocted a clever centerfold painting in which a summer garden party at Friar Park is attended by a host of George's closest friends. Evans is in the picture. Despite his sometimes gruff exterior, Harrison is actually quite sentimental. Author John Blake, in his 1981 book The Beatles After the Beatles, says that when Harrison and the other Beatles heard of Mal's death, they broke down and wept. Although it makes a good tale, it doesn't really seem very likely. The Beatles just aren't the crying kind. For George Harrison, the next 2 years were eventful and productive. On June 9, 1977, he and Patty were granted a divorce in London on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. For Olivia and George and Patty and Eric, it was a chance to finally cut loose from the past and begin again. In a rare 1985 comment to the press, Patty said of her days as the first Mrs. Harrison, "They were good times, with so many laughs. I don't regret a thing. I still try on an old miniskirt once in a while. I just cannot believe that we really wore them that short." After his wife Louise died, Harry Harrison often went to visit his sons at Friar Park. Growing his striking silver hair well past his shoulders, the 65-year-old began spending a lot of time with George and his friends, even joining his son on the road for the 1974 Dark Horse Tour. The elder Harrison was happier and more fulfilled than he had ever dreamed possible. Although he missed Louise terribly, he had made a good life for himself at Appleton and seemed quite content to putter around in the garden or take a stroll to his local pub for a friendly pint or two with his mates. One evening in May of 1978, George and Olivia went to bed early after a particularly exhausting day. Sometime during the night, George became aware of a dull blue and gold light ringing the darkened room. Suddenly, there was his father, standing solemnly in the middle of the large room, looking lovingly down at his astonished son. After a moment or two, Harry quietly bade George and his brothers farewell, and then he disappeared. That same day at his home in Cheshire, Harry Harrison died of emphysema, related to a lifetime of very heavy smoking. Although everyone was saddened and upset, George was comforted somewhat by what he considered to be his father's spiritual, auspicious passing. On August 1st, 1978, George and Olivia's only son, Danhi, was born at the Princess Christian Nursing Home at Windsor, just a short hop down the highway from Friar Park. Danhi is the Sanskrit word for wealthy, but Harrison insists he was only aware of its significance in terms of relating to his beloved Indian music, the basic scale of which is sa-da-ni-sa, or sa-da-ni-sa. So excited was George by the birth of his son and heir that he rushed down to his friend Rodney Turner's in Henley to pick up a new baby blue Rolls-Royce he had ordered in celebration of the great event. Harrison was like a man reborn. So concerned and possessive was he that for the next few months only he and Olivia were allowed to touch young Danhi. Like John Lennon after his son Sean was born, George was frantic that the baby might pick up something if handled by anyone. These Beatles, it seems, take their babies very seriously. George and Olivia invited her parents to fly over from California to be the sole guests at their secret wedding on September 2 at the Henley Registry Office. Sometime later, the happy couple treated themselves to a luxurious honeymoon in Tunisia. By the time they returned, George was anxious to get back to work. Harrison's first musical project following his father's passing and Dunhee's arrival was the masterfully conceived and lyrically brilliant George Harrison, issued in England on February 23, 1979. The LP featured 10 thoughtful new tracks and was once again infused with Harrison's familiar Krishna-conscious philosophy, only this time presented in a far more palatable manner, sandwiched as it was between a lot of genuinely great music. 1979 brought with it some interesting developments. On March 27, Eric Clapton, dressed in an oft-white cowboy hat, white tux, and black vest, tied the knot with Petty Harrison at the Temple Bethel in Tucson, Arizona, in front of 40 of the couple's closest friends. Clapton was reportedly 2 hours late for the brief 20-minute ceremony, and in the end didn't have the $8 fee for the pastor. Fortunately, a friend quickly stepped in and settled the debt. As close as George and the new Mrs. Harrison supposedly still were to the bride and groom, they chose not to attend the service. On May 19, however, almost all of rock's upper echelon dropped what they were doing to attend a grand reception for the happy couple held in Clapton's sprawling back garden at Hurtwood Edge, his baronial estate in the tiny village of Ewhurst. By 1980, George was beginning to feel that the time was right to record yet another album. Gathering together an array of old friends, Ringo, Alla Rocca, Ray Cooper, Herbie Flowers, Willie Weeks, Al Cooper, Jim Keltner, and Tom Scott, Harrison began sessions at Friar Park for what would later become Somewhere in England. The album Harrison submitted to Warner Brothers Records in Los Angeles consisted of 8 new tracks as well as 2 old standards, Baltimore Oriole and Hong Kong Blues. It also included a suitably slick, sophisticated cover photo of George's profile merged with a satellite shot of a cloudy Great Britain. Warner Brothers, unfortunately, was not particularly impressed with either the music or art and tersely rejected the album. In the end, 4 tracks were cut: the inimitable Flying Hour, Lay His Head, Sat Singing, and Tears of the World, and in their place, 4 new Harris songs were added: Teardrops, Blood from a Clone, That Which I Have Lost, and All Those Years Ago. A new cover was also put together by Ray Cooper and photographer Carolyn Irwin. Recorded at Friar Park Studios, All Those Years Ago was originally intended as a vehicle for Ringo, but following Lennon's murder in December 1980, it was rewritten by George to include specific references to the tragedy. On the spur of the moment, Harrison decided it would be fitting if he were joined on the session by Ringo and Paul. Happily they agreed, thus making it the first and only Beatles reunion of the new decade. Produced with the help of George Martin, the song included backup vocals by Linda McCartney and Denny Laine, who tells me he has yet to be paid for the session. Although it was a pretty bleak circumstance under which to record a new Beatles song, it was nevertheless a touching gesture. The tune rose to number 2 in the charts and remains a popular jukebox hit in North America to this day. One subject interviewed for this book revealed that even in death, John Lennon shared an unbreakable bond with his musical colleague, George. As Lennon was wheeled into the emergency room of Roosevelt Hospital the night of the shooting, the blood-soaked stretcher was left for a moment while the staff prepared a special room in which to work on the mortally wounded singer. Among the other patients in the ward that evening was a young father and his slightly injured toddler son. Gruesome as the sight of the gasping, rapidly fading man on the gurney was, several patients recognized him. Slowly rising to his feet, the young father dropped his son's hand, stepped up to Lennon, and began to softly chant Hare Krishna into his ear. Just then the hospital staff pushed him out of the way in a vain attempt to resuscitate the dying legend. According to Hindu belief, however, he who hears the holy transcendental vibration of the Hare Krishna mantra at the time of death is forgiven for all accumulated sins and is immediately transferred to Krishna's timeless heaven, Goloka Vrindavan, in the anti-material spiritual sky. George Harrison was at home sleeping when the phone rang. The jarring noise startled him and left him shaking for a moment. Before he even touched the receiver, he felt that something must be terribly wrong. The wavering, crackling line told him instantly that the call was from overseas. It was Louise, Harrison's eldest sister, who had lived stateside for many years. George quickly began to prepare himself for what he thought surely must be bad news. The next morning, Derek Taylor, the Beatles' former publicity man, wandered over to Apple's last sorry incarnation on St. James Street to sit with the company's managing director, Neil Aspinall, and wait for the calls to start flooding in. John Lennon had been shot dead by a maniac at point-blank range on December 8, 1980, as he and Yoko were returning from a late-night mixing session for a tune called Walking on Thin Ice. After a couple of awkward hours spent painfully reminiscing, Taylor and Aspinall said goodbye. Derek walked into the street and caught a cab to George Harrison's London office. A short time later, he summoned up the courage to finally ring George. After a decade spent on the telephone, this was one call he dreaded. "George, maybe you should make some sort of statement just to get the bastards off your back." "I can't now," Harrison replied. There was a long pause. "Later, maybe." The line suddenly clicked off. Taylor replaced the receiver and lit a cigarette. He didn't want to push the issue, but his better judgment told him that the longer George waited to speak, the worse it would ultimately be. Less than an hour later, he was back on the line to Friar Park. This time, George agreed to help the misty-eyed PR man formulate a statement for the press. "After all we went through together, I had and still have great love and respect for John Lennon. I am shocked and stunned. To rob life is the ultimate robbery. This perpetual encroachment on other people's space is taken to the limit with the use of a gun. It is an outrage that people can take other people's lives when they obviously haven't got their own lives in order." After phoning the copy through to all the major London news agencies, Taylor caught the train home to Brundon Mills, his elegant country home in Suffolk, bought by a lifetime of carefully chosen words. He wept softly as he stared out the train window, and like millions of other people around the world, asked himself simply, why? Lennon's death wasn't the only sadness Harrison experienced that year. On July 24, 1980, at age 54, Peter Sellers, one of his oldest and dearest friends, died of a massive heart attack in the intensive care unit of a London hospital. The comedic actor managed to survive for 36 hours before finally succumbing. Through George, Sellers had become interested in Krishna consciousness and yogic philosophy. He had even met Srila Prabhupada several times in the mid-70s. Reportedly, towards the end of his life, he no longer even thought of himself as an actor, but rather an aspiring yogi. Although Peter's life had always been rather turbulent, his moments with George were particularly precious to both men. For more than 2 years in the mid-1980s, I was roommates with Legs Larry Smith, the former drummer of the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. Together we were writing a screenplay entitled Half of Larry's Lunch. We lived in the large baronial home in Hambledon, Oxfordshire, of John Lord, the keyboard player for Deep Purple. The house was just a stone's throw from Friar Park and the often wonderfully unreal world of George and his friends. I drank at the same pubs, ordered Chinese from the same seedy takeout restaurants, rode in the same cabs, and choked back the same gooey black Afghan hash favored by Oxfordshire's rock elite. There is nowhere else in the world like Henley. Rod Stewart can often be seen shopping for tea biscuits at Waitrose. Mary Hopkin might be motoring past in an old auto left over from her marriage to millionaire record producer Tony Visconti. Living within a 10-mile radius are David Gilmour, Elvin Lee, 60 Crooners Joe Brown, half of Deep Purple, and more roadies, big-time groupies, and part-time dope dealers than you can shake a tie stick at. To the faithful, George Harrison reigns supreme as the peaceful valley's mystical feudal lord. In Henley, a late-night invitation to Friar Park is like summons to court in the bygone days of Camelot. Harrison is more a living icon to these people than a man, the exiled Dalai Lama of rock and roll, holding forth in his walled city of pleasure. His calls are carefully screened first by the park's office personnel, then by Olivia herself. Even the message on Harrison's answering machine was recorded by his wife in her uniquely American twang. George's sultry voice is not heard by anyone outside the inner circle. One wrong number, and his carefully manicured cover might be blown forever. My entree into this topsy-turvy world of show business elitism was, of course, Larry, perhaps George's best friend at the time. After a while, the day-to-day goings-on at Friar Park became rather a daily topic of conversation between us. Larry was always very guarded, however, and I got the feeling that his relationship with Harrison was definitely the one bright spot in his otherwise rather dreary existence. More than once he had tantalized me with some juicy tidbit of Harrison gossip, only to immediately pull back at the very moment I began to respond.
One time in Toronto, he waved a private letter George had written him from Hawaii under my nose, only to snap it back into his coat pocket as soon as I was able to make out who it was from. Former model Kirsten Grepney is also a regular visitor to Friar Park. "We have had some very happy times up there," says Kirsten. "George is into racing cars." At the park, Olivia does most of the cooking, with her specialty being Mexican vegetarian fare. But occasionally, Harrison has been known to rustle up a pretty mean cheese and mushroom omelet. According to just about everyone in the family, young Danny is the light of George's life. Rumor has it that longtime aide and close friend of Harrison, Terry Doran, was dismissed in the mid-'80s after 20 years of loyal service because he was overtly homosexual, and Olivia felt he might be a bad influence on their young son. In spite of the Harrisons' devotion to their son, one or two people once close to George say they often feel quite sorry for Danny. "When I used to go up there, he always rushed out the door like mad to get me to play with him. He'd hang on me practically the whole time I was there. It was like he was somehow isolated in that big, drafty house. It seemed as though he wasn't getting the male companionship he apparently needed, and therefore was often quite starved for attention. When I knew him, George and Olivia didn't generally get up until 2 or 3 in the afternoon, so what is the kid supposed to do?" By all accounts, Olivia would love to have another child, as she is concerned about the effect that so much inherited wealth and power will have on their only son. Still, for the moment anyway, Danny remains reasonably unspoiled by the milieu in which he lives. "He's a very nice-looking boy," says Kirsten. "I'd put it down to him just being a nice kid, well-mannered and polite. He goes to a local primary school, which is their choice. They obviously feel that they would like him to be brought up just as normal as possible. I stopped being as crazy as I used to be because I want this child to have a father a bit longer," George has said. "Also, with a child around, I can realize what it was like to be my father. At the same time, you can also relive certain aspects of being a child. You watch them and have all these flashbacks of when you were a kid. It somehow completes the generation thing." He also wants very much to teach his son proper values. "I try to make him realize that not everyone lives in such a big house or has as much money as we do. That's a very difficult lesson to teach someone in his position, but we think we do a fairly good job." By all accounts, George's second marriage has worked out far better than his first. Old friend Mukunda Goswami also feels that the atmosphere at the park is very much improved since 1984, when Olivia first moved in. As far as George and Olivia are concerned, there are occasional strains on the marriage. For a brief time in the early 80s, George reportedly became rather too fond of staying up all night, snorting cocaine with the neighborhood lads. Back in 1983 and 84, when I was in Henley, the dreaded white powder was everywhere. More than once I'd heard the phone ring at Larry's in the middle of the night and heard Smith talking to George about taking the Frenchman to the park right away, the Frenchman being their code word for coke. While speaking over the telephone, grabbing a small green hand-painted suitcase, Larry would rush around the tiny flat, gathering up his stash for the late-night rendezvous with Harrison. And it didn't really matter if one of Larry's many girlfriends happened to be staying over, either. When George beckoned, Smith, inevitably, went running. Perhaps the best quip I heard regarding the devil's dandruff or cocaine during my stay in Henley was from Derek Taylor, who said to me, "Coke makes you feel like a new man. Then the new man wants a line." This apparently was what happened to George and his friends. My friend John Lord from Deep Purple, who was also very close to George, told me that he used to get so desperate for a toot that to stop himself, he would hide his stash under the nanny's mattress every evening. Once the rather innocent young lady went to bed, there was no way he could get to it. Sources close to the Harrisons have suggested that at first George went out of his way to hide his recreational drug use from Olivia, which served to erect a wall of secrecy between the normally close couple. After a time, though, he finally confided in her, but the naturally conservative young woman found it very difficult to either accept or understand. One episode I was made aware of in 1983 illustrates the intensity of the Henley-on-Thames cocaine connection. One evening, a well-known bisexual piano player by the name of Elton John arrived unexpectedly at the park with a lovely young lady in tow, with the intention of spending a rollicking evening partying with Mr. and Mrs. Harrison. George, however, was fresh out of blow, so politely excused himself to call a local dealer who might be able to help. Not having anything to party with would have been a serious lapse of pop star etiquette,
But luckily, the diminutive superstar hadn't come empty-handed, and with a flourish produced a small plastic bag containing 5 grams of fluffy, oily Peruvian flake. Pouring the entire contents onto a small mirror, he gestured to George to take the first hit. Acting under the old doper's axiom that the first line is always the best, Harrison bent over and deeply inhaled the oily powder with a thin glass straw. "Go on, mate. Have another," said Elton. "Give us a minute," said Harrison. "I've just had a huge one. Let me enjoy it." Appetite for cocaine was allegedly so strong that during this time, when he went on holiday to Hawaii or Australia, as the joke goes, Henley's many dealers had to go on the dole until he returned. That is not to say, however, that all George did during the early 80s was to sit on his ass hoovering up cocaine. He also found time to record one disastrous album. Gone Troppo, released on October 27, 1982, was Harrison's most disappointing LP since the abysmal Zapple release Electronic Sound in May 1969. Although both the performance and production were competent, the songs were contrived and, even worse, uninteresting. Harrison soon discovered that the record business of the early 80s was far different from what it had been just a decade earlier. They all started to cut corners, and a lot of artists were cut. The radio stations, at least in America, seemed to me to be going crazy. They didn't have the direction there because there was a general confusion going on. Why did Gone Troppo fail? Because I was fed up with people saying, "Oh, maybe you should do this kind of song or that kind of song." It's time to give up when you're not allowed or expected to be yourself. My music is like me. It's a reflection of me. And if you don't like that or it doesn't fit in, I'm not going to come out there and pretend to be Michael Jackson, because I'm not. Following the commercial failure of Gone Troppo and a rather rough patch finding audiences for the various handmade epics, Harrison all but dropped from sight for the next few months. He spent his time shuttling between Friar Park, Maui, and Hamilton Island, Australia. Sometimes he took along Dani and Olivia, and sometimes he didn't. Gone were his pristine spiritual aspirations. When longtime Hare Krishna devotee and old friend Dhananjaya Das dropped by the park one rainy, wind-swept evening late in 1983, Harrison entertained him only briefly, then showed him the door, saying gruffly, "Why don't you go out and get yourself a couple of beers down you? You're boring." Your devotee reminded George that it had been almost 10 years since they had last seen each other. Harrison responded, "So? We're not lovers. Why are you here anyway?" The embarrassed young man didn't bother to contact him again. "Poor George is really in Maya, or illusion," he told me over the phone later that week. "I've never seen him looking so bad." Clearly, the once dynamic musician and poet was adrift on a sea of inner turmoil and hopelessness. All this stuff about the Beatles being able to save the world was rubbish, George told me in 1983. "I can't even save myself. It was just people trying to put the responsibility on our shoulders. The thing about the Beatles is that they saved the world from boredom. I mean, even when we got to America the first time, everybody was running around with Bermuda shorts on, brush cuts, and braces on their teeth. But we really didn't create any great change. We just heralded that change of consciousness that happened to be there in the 60s. We went along with it, that's all. The whole Beatles thing is like a nightmare. I don't even like to talk about it. I just hate it." After he made this startling declaration to me, he left the house, and I never saw him again. At this particularly low point in Harrison's eventful life, all that beautiful music, art, poetry, peace and love, Hare Krishna philosophy, and his rather consistent, sustained vision for a better world seemed to have spiraled its way right out from this world-weary soul. Looking ages older than his then 40 years, George Harrison confronted an unknown future. "You can walk away from it all at any time," he told John and Vicky Lord one evening in 1983 over drinks. But not even he looked as if he believed it. Duis non fortuna, God, not fortune, the ancient Harrison family motto, forging a life. Past is gone, thou canst not that recall. Future is not, may not be at all. Present is, improve the flying hour. Present only is within thy power. Sir Frank Crisp.
Chapter 10. George Harrison is pretty stingy when it comes to accepting as real anything he feels is born of the ego, whether it's his or anyone else's. Even the things he seems to genuinely love, like auto racing, producing movies, and his music, are not exempt. In this, Harrison keeps true to his covenant to try and eliminate the tricky I, me, and mine that have vexed him all of his life. It is a measure of the man's dogged integrity that he simply refuses to compromise when it comes to playing out the tired role of Beatle George. All he wants these days is to be himself, which of course is pretty much a full-time job for anyone. By the early 80s, one of the few areas of George's life for which he had not yet lost enthusiasm was car racing. I liked it since I was a kid, he has said. It's a bit more interesting for me now because of having friends like Jackie Stewart. I know all of the backroom stuff that goes on, perhaps a bit too much of it. In late 1977, George traded his beloved BMW for a souped-up Porsche Turbo. He and Olivia then broke the car in by driving it up and down the twisting roads of France, eventually meeting up with Ringo and a lady friend to take in the Monte Carlo Grand Prix. Like Hare Krishna and the mind-expanding hallucinogens of yesteryear, fast cars were quickly becoming George's new obsession. At Friar Park, the garage was soon filled with several customized Porsches, as well as an awesome Ferrari Dino Spider. Eventually, Harrison's passion for racing extended beyond simply adoring the monster machines of racing and began to focus in on the daredevil lifestyle of the men who drove them. One of the Harrisons' closest friends during this period was Scotsman Jackie Stewart, though soon Harrison also began palling around with such racing greats as Ronnie Peterson, Mario Andretti, Barry Sheene, and James Hunt. Stewart, who was at his peak as a driver during the heyday of the Fab Four, was an unabashed Beatles fan. Harrison impressed Stewart with his encyclopedic knowledge of racing and of Stewart's celebrated career. Whenever he spoke publicly of his interest in racing, George never missed an opportunity to praise the diminutive driver. Jackie did a lot for the sport and was criticized for it, he told England's Motor magazine in the mid-'80s. People moaned and groaned when he wore fireproof suits and talked of safety, things which were so obvious and practical now, but at the time were being put down for some reason. Another thing was, he always projected the sport beyond just the racing enthusiast, which I think is very important. Perhaps one of the most bizarre aspects of George's personality is the fascination he shares with friends Derek Taylor and Legs Larry Smith regarding Adolf Hitler. Harrison and his pals are certainly not Nazi sympathizers, but they still find something undeniably fascinating about the Führer. It's just that they appreciate the unparalleled degree of his absolute madness, says a friend. Old Adolf was so incredibly off his rocker that he eventually convinced himself that only his version of reality was the right one. What's even more surreal was his ability to convince so many others as well. While there have certainly been a lot of loony leaders throughout history, none, so far as George and his mates are concerned, possessed the same magical ability to drag so many other so-called sane people into his desperate psychosis along with him. They only dig him in a sort of Monty Python-esque way, like a crazy character from some mad movie. As far as the horrible things he actually did, they, of course, are certainly just as appalled as anyone else. Such tidy rationalizations, however, fall short of explaining just why Harrison keeps so many photos of Hitler around his house. Allegedly, he even displays a huge German swastika at times. Although Hitler borrowed the symbol of eternal life from Harrison's beloved Hindus, it is still rather difficult to imagine just how the normally peace-loving Beatle justifies this attraction to evil. It may be, however, that Derek Taylor is the real instigator of this rather sick fantasy. Larry, for his part, has been working for years now on a zany musical based on the life of the silver-tongued Austrian entitled Call Me Adolf. With such song titles as I've Got a Brawn New Girl and the Führerburger, it is doubtful that any legitimate producer would ever consider bringing it to the stage, no matter how clever or catchy the ex-Bonzo Dog drummer's calypso-inspired rhythms. When I was living in Henley, I answered a telephone call one evening from Derek Taylor. For 15 minutes, the semi-retired publicist talked about which photographer had taken the most charismatic shots of the Führer. Strange indeed.
While most of the world thinks of George as a fine musician and a dedicated part-time philanthropist, in 1978 the mercurial minstrel startled everyone by changing hats to become the spiritual powerhouse behind Handmade Film Productions Limited, a London-based partnership put together by Harrison and his personal manager, Dennis O'Brien, an American investment banker and attorney. The infant company's first project was to bail out the controversial Monty Python parody, The Life of Brian. The twisted spoof of Brian, a reluctant and immensely unqualified messiah, has grossed more than $24 million in the United States since its release in October of 1979. "Look, I'm not a businessman," says Harrison. A prime example of Harrison's desire to produce small films that might otherwise have been overlooked was Handmade's compelling Mona Lisa, the bittersweet love story about an ex-con from London who becomes infatuated with a high-priced bisexual hooker. Starring ace character man Bob Hoskins, the film captured the Best Actor award at the 1986 Cannes Film Festival and an Academy Award nomination in the same category. George was delighted. All things considered, Handmaid was doing quite well until rock singer Madonna and her hot-tempered actor husband Sean Penn entered the scene in 1986. George put up more than $15 million to film the dismally predictable screenplay called Shanghai Surprise, a romantic adventure comedy starring the naughty Penns. The story was set in the 1930s with pop goddess Madonna cast as a missionary of all things, with Sean a fast-talking soldier of fortune. Not surprisingly, the hokey film was universally maligned by critics and became the laughingstock of Hollywood. Sean was an actor chosen as a feisty young guy, says George. Apart from all the bullshit, he's a nice and talented actor. You have to separate two things, his job and his ability to do that job, and the sensationalism because he happens to be married to Madonna. When asked what she thought of her Beatle boss, Madonna replied, "He's great, very understanding and sympathetic. He's given me more advice on how to deal with the press, though, than how to make movies." Harrison tried his best to protect his young stars, but after the movie was finished and eventually flopped, he was characteristically blunt in his appraisal of the two. "Penn is a pain in the ass," he complained to the Hollywood Reporter. And Madonna, he was quoted in Clio magazine as saying, "All this aloofness and star stuff, it's just bullshit. Look, I'm not trying to be nasty. She's probably got a lot in her that hasn't even been discovered, but she has to realize that you can be a fabulous person and humble as well." The only real redeeming aspect of Shanghai Surprise was its brilliant soundtrack, which was arranged chiefly by George. Although unreleased on record, the movie's title track, an exotic otherworldly duet between Harrison and Vicki Brown, singer Joe's wife, indicated that George Harrison was still a musical force to be reckoned with. As intent as George was to lie low musically during the latter half of the decade, by January 1986 he experienced a head-on collision with his intentions for an early retirement. The unlikely harbinger of Harrison's renewed enthusiasm for his art came in the person of affable country rocker Carl Perkins, one of George's earliest and most important musical influences. Perkins, then 53, was musically as sharp as ever, but in the past few years he had experienced a serious slump in his remarkable career. How ironic that the musician who helped inspire Harrison to pick up the guitar in the first place would be responsible for bringing him back into the fold. Seriously considering retirement himself, Perkins and his manager cooked up the idea of a star-studded rockabilly extravaganza, featuring the creme de la creme of the pop world in a concert designed to showcase Perkins' exceptional talents. To that end, he videotaped personalized invitations to Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, and George Harrison, among others. Within 10 days, Harrison had received notes of acceptance from everyone he contacted, with the exception of George. "I thought I was wasting my time," Perkins told People magazine, "because I'd read that George would never go before a live audience again." Several days later, however, Harrison enthusiastically accepted, and the big show was on. Perkins wasn't the first of his peers to try and coax George on stage after his unhappy tour of America in 1974. New York promoter Sid Bernstein attempted to get the Beatles together for an internationally televised benefit in 1979 to aid Cambodia's boat people, as did United Nations Secretary Kurt Waldheim for another concert later that year.
Both efforts unfortunately failed to convince Harrison to perform. Until Carl Perkins ambled onto the scene in 1985, most observers doubted whether Harrison would ever perform on stage again. Harrison's next major appearance came 4 months later on June 5 and 6. The occasion was the Prince's Trust annual charity concerts at Wembley Stadium just outside London. As usual, rumors of an impending Beatles reunion were rife, but came to nothing. And why did George finally decide to do the shows? Well, it's for a good cause, and I happen to like Prince Charles and his trust, he told reporters backstage. Once again, though, playing live for an audience did tend to make him rather tense. Oh, it's nerve-wracking, he said. I haven't done a show in England since 1966, and the last time I did a concert tour was 1974, so it makes you nervous when you don't perform all the time. George's next album release following the Gone Troppo fiasco took place on November 2, 1987, with the issuance of the iconic Cloud 9. This time, however, George was fully committed to the album's promotion and made himself available to the media, which made a great difference. Harrison had wanted to call the album Fab as a joke on his Beatle past, but changed his mind after seeing pictures of himself standing with his guitar in front of a panorama of puffy clouds. I racked my brain for weeks and months to try and think of a title because I was trying not to have a song title, Harrison explained. In the end, I just had to have a title, otherwise the album would never have come out. So as it was clouds on the cover, we called it Cloud 9. Although many people think of Cloud 9 as Harrison's comeback album, he bristles at the description. People think in terms of a comeback, but I haven't really been anywhere, he said. I've been here the entire time, and this record is very much the music I wanted to make. I don't think it's right to try and mold you into doing something that's simply current for the market. It's like the old song says, take me as I am or let me go. This is me, and I certainly hope to fit in, but I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. Harrison was also part of the magnificent Traveling Wilburys. It was the first time George had been a member of a bona fide group in more than 18 years. The inception of the big-name band, including Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and George, came about rather casually as an outgrowth of the Cloud 9 project. In April 1988, Harrison was in Los Angeles tying up some loose ends regarding the album when Warner Brothers asked him to consider recording a new tune to back the 12-inch extended play version of the popular This Is Love. George, however, couldn't think of anything he had back at Friar Park that would be suitable, so he mentioned his dilemma to Lynne and Orbison during dinner at a swanky L.A. eatery. George suggested that the three of them book some studio time and record something or other. Orbison and Lynne readily agreed. Bearing in mind the time restraints placed upon the trio by the record company, Lynne suggested asking Bob Dylan if they might use his private studio, located in the garage of his luxurious Malibu home. A few days later, Harrison dropped by Tom Petty's house to pick up a guitar for the session, and on the spur of the moment invited Petty to join them. George and Jeff wrote the tune together the next day in the studio, and then persuaded Dylan to sit in as well. Lynne and Harrison came up with the name Traveling Wilburys from a joke bandied about during the long 8-month sessions for Cloud 9. Apparently, someone coined the phrase Tremblin' Wilburys to describe the unwelcome little screw-ups and glitches that occurred while they were recording the multi-track masters, and the name stuck. A full year before he even thought of putting a group together, Harrison had some custom guitar picks made up with the name Traveling Wilburys printed along the top. In keeping with the zany spirit of the album, the five co-conspirators decided to adopt bizarre new Wilbury names. Harrison took the alias Nelson Wilbury, while Dylan assumed the name Lucky. Petty was Charlie T., while Orbison was called Lefty. The album, entitled The Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, was released on October 25, 1988, on the newly formed Wilbury Records, distributed by Warner Brothers. MTV in America premiered the classy Handle with Care video with much fanfare on October 25, and within a few short weeks the album was selling like hotcakes on both sides of the Atlantic. There was talk of a Wilbury tour, although it never happened, scheduled for some time in the new year, while Volume 2 was eagerly awaited by a whole new breed of Wilbury maniacs.
The Wilburys' curtain, however, came crashing to the ground with the sudden death of Roy Orbison on December 6, 1988, from a massive heart attack. Upon hearing the tragic news, George told reporters that Roy was a sweet, sweet man. We loved Roy and still do. But he's out there, really, his spirit, you know. Life flows on within you and without you. Roy is around. No matter how high any of the surviving Beatles fly in their solo careers, there will always be the inevitable push to get them back together just one more time. The public's endless fascination with the Beatles is a frustrating mystery to George, as he told me many years ago. The Beatles can't save the world. We'll be lucky if we can even save ourselves. Still, he knows the fans will always dream of a reunion, even if it includes only 3/4 of the original group. Look, I've got a problem, I must admit, when people try to get the Beatles together. They're still suggesting it, even now that John is dead. I suppose the three of us could get back together, but it was such a struggle to find our individual identities after the Beatles. Although he has lived most of his life in the never-ending scrutiny of the media, George Harrison has always managed to be very much. Although he has lived his life in the never-ending scrutiny of the media, George Harrison has always managed to be very much his own man. Whereas most people tended to see the Beatles as public property, Harrison has remained aloof. Like a lotus flower growing in an oily, polluted river, its delicate petals never getting wet, George Harrison, with few exceptions, has remained unscathed from a potentially lethal dose of fame and fortune. Even when he fell, and fall he did many times, he never surrendered his ideals or his stubbornly held right to live out his life the way he wanted to. Often down, but so far never out, his steadfast allegiance to his unique vision of truth has served him well. In a brief, dark world, George's faith has been a beacon of reflected life for himself and countless others as well. For the forest to be green, each tree must be green, Harrison has often quoted the Maharishi. The movement you need is on your shoulders, says another old friend. Still, no matter how you say it, or which way you choose to look, Harrison's truth belongs to all of us as well. And maybe that's what we admire most about the man after all these years. Like the simple Chauncey Gardiner in the film Being There, George Harrison is carefully cultivating his own small garden of truth season after season, which of course is really just about all any of us can do.
Chapter 11. Second Thoughts. Harrison Beyond. George Harrison remains entirely faithful to Krishna consciousness. Derek Taylor, 1983. George Harrison has precious little future as a member of the Beatles. He first realized this way back in August 1966 when the Fabs played their last official note together at Candlestick Park. Although untold millions can certainly still be generated by the mere rattle of the Beatles' aging vocal cords into a microphone, the magic is long gone, the grandeur extinct. The nostalgia generated by such non-events as the Fabs' recent reunion only whispers to the majesty that once was, something George Harrison knows better than anyone. Oh, he'll take the money if it's handy, maybe even turn up for a few perfunctory performances every now and again, but his heart certainly isn't in it. Unlike Paul McCartney, the eternal wide-eyed 15-year-old with his head firmly fixed in the clouds, or the post-alcoholic Ringo Starr, Harrison disdains the fame fix, as he has quite consistently from almost day one. Despite the massive hype generated by Apple, EMI, Capitol, and ABC here in America, the Beatles' latest recycled product line left millions cold, amongst them, apparently, George Harrison. As Paul McCartney recently explained, I think it would have been okay with me and John, and I think Ringo certainly would have been fine with it. I'd managed to make my peace with John a good few months before he was killed, but George hadn't, you see. I'm not sure whether they weren't talking or what, but George did this big book, his life story, I Me Mine, and barely mentioned John. Naturally, Lennon was upset. George is a very forthright character, you must understand. He says exactly what he thinks. To tell you the truth, he really wasn't all that keen on Free as a Bird.
he was saying to me, well, I just sort of felt John was going off a bit towards the end of his songwriting. McCartney's observations certainly contain at least an element of truth. Regarding Free as a Bird, Harrison wasn't all that thrilled with it, as he admitted in a recent interview. I actually preferred Real Love as a song. I thought the melody was more obvious. Obvious, perhaps, but not all that easy to work with. The cassette version that Yoko passed along was recorded on a wobbly 4-track Portastudio, notorious for the noise they introduced to tape. Further, John double-tracked the vocal and also included a very loud tambourine into the haphazard mix. Fortunately, producer Jeff Lynne contacted a top computer man, and together they spent a few tedious days eliminating virtually everything but John's haunting vocal. The resulting track is quite remarkable considering the tribulations of its perilous beginnings. I really have no concept of myself, no image I'm trying to get across, Harrison has said. I consider myself as much a filmmaker as I do an ex-pop star. Now I say ex because to me pop stars are teenagers, and I'm certainly not that, for sure. Look, I play a little guitar, I write some tunes, and I make a few movies. I even do a little gardening, but none of those are the real me. The real me is something entirely different, just like the real you. So where then is George's heart when not on public display as the reluctant, retired lead guitarist of the Fearsome Four? Today, at 50-plus years old, waking up daily in his palatial Oxfordshire folly, Friar Park, what can he possibly look forward to? Harrison certainly loves his family, there's no doubt about that. But at least as far as his second wife Olivia is concerned, he merely stumbles from day to day, as quizzical about his role as husband and father as he is about being quarter owner of the eternal Beatles Apple cash cow. Even for those closest to him, George has never been an easy man to warm up to. Fortunately, George's saber-like cynicism rejects, at least privately, the advances of any smarmy crowd. On the surface, then, Harrison's life approximates the same unhappiness, puny intrigue, self-doubt, tedium, and hopelessness as anyone's. But there is yet another side to this craggy-faced former pop star, a presence that slowly and consistently fills the void carved by the mountains of empty adulation and materialism which surround him, and that, quite simply, is his nearly lifelong search for a conscious, transcendent connection to his own personal godhead, the shining, rain-cloud-colored, flute-playing, almighty Lord Shri Krishna. As Harrison recalls, an early encounter in India profoundly altered his definition of success. A yogi I met said, "You're really lucky. You have youth, fame, fortune, health, but at the same time, that's not enough for you. You want to know about something else. Most of the time, people don't get to the point where they realize there even is something beyond that wall. They're just trying to get on top to be able to eat, have a nice house, be comfortable, and all of that. I was very fortunate to get all of that in time to realize that there's something else to life, whereas most people get worn out just trying to attain purely material things. As one matures spiritually, the tendency to deny the world mellows into a fluffy kind of acceptance that, for better or worse, here we are, and beyond our own internal work, there's really not a lot one can do about it. Certainly, the ability to meaningfully alter anyone other than oneself is implausible, if not impossible. And working on himself is exactly what Harrison is doing these days. Having long since given up his savage addiction to smoking, he has also cut way back on his consumption of red wine, chicken, fish, and various other substances now taboo in light of his renewed spiritual aspirations. Krishna consciousness isn't something I do in the road anymore, he stated during a New Zealand press conference in 1984. It's something I do inside myself. Reduced to its essence, what we have then is a new provisional 1997 George Harrison, a hollow, holy, walking, talking automaton of the sly Beatle we once knew. In the same way castles are moved brick by brick from one continent to another, Jairaj Harisan, George's wry Indo version of his name, is slowly relocating to the transcendental realm of Goloka Vrindavan, the Vaishnava's ideal of heaven, and he couldn't be happier. Mukunda Das Goswami has not only been a true friend to George over the years, but also his one consistent inspirational link to ISKCON, or the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. He remembered Harrison's first encounter with Srila Prabhupada's blossoming movement. We had actually been in touch with George and John. I think they ordered about 300 copies of the record Prabhupada made in New York in 1967. There was a general interest among the Beatles in what we were doing because at the time they were with the Maharishi, so that was an encouragement. These days, Harrison tends to avoid the media like the plague and virtually never gives interviews unless it's directly in his interest to do so. On occasion, however, he has made himself available to various devotees for private discussions on both his remembrances of his spiritual master, Srila Prabhupada, and the engaging, expansive philosophy he first brought to the West. I had a copy of the Hare Krishna album with Prabhupada singing Hare Krishna with the devotees. Harrison told Satsrup Das Goswami during the preparation for his extended biography of Bhaktivedanta Swami. I'd had the record at least 2 years. I got it the week it was pressed. I was open to it. You attract those things. I used to play it a lot of the time. I was chanting Hare Krishna long before I met Shyamasundar, Gurudas, and Mukunda. I was just pleased to hear the Hare Krishna mantra and have a copy of the record. I already knew about Prabhupada from reading the liner notes on the album. Having been to India, I could tell where the devotees were coming from with their style of dress and shave heads. I'd seen them on the streets of Los Angeles and New York. Having read so many books and looking for yogis, my concept of the devotees wasn't quite like other people who think they've all escaped from a lunatic asylum in their pajamas. I was aware of the movement, and that it was a pretty heavy one with more austerities than other groups like no coffee, chocolate, or tea. Over the past year, Harrison not only attended but pretty much led the 25th anniversary of the Hare Krishna movement's first trek into Britain. It was held at the baronial Bhaktivedanta Manor in Radlett outside London. Sitting in a large circle and leading the collective chanting along with his old pals Gurudas, Shyamasundar, Mukunda, Malati Dasi, and many others, Harrison played harmonium. He closed his eyes and, ignoring the whirling video cameras and instamatics, sailed away on the magic carpet of transcendental sound vibration flying about the room. To my mind, one of the greatest projects produced by Harrison and his great friend and mentor Ravi Shankar were the Shankar Family and Friend albums of the mid-1970s. The first LP featured Indian luminaries Ravi Shankar, Lakshmi Shankar, Kamala Chakravarti, L. Subramaniam, Fakir Muhammad, and Alaraka. As for George's Western colleagues, the album boasted such seasoned musicians as Ringo Starr, Tom Scott, Klaus Voormann, Billy Preston, Nicky Hopkins, Paul Beaver, Jim Keltner, and Vinnie Poncia. Musically, the beautifully produced 9-track album featured such orthodox Krishna-conscious compositions as Jaya Jagadisha Hari, which the charmingly illustrated liner notes refer to as an old Sanskrit song extolling the wonder, power, and majesty of Vishnu in his 10 incarnations, written by the poet Jayadev of Bengal. The remaining tracks, too, all speak directly of Krishna. One suspects that perhaps here was George's outlet for the new world of ideas he was experiencing through his meditational practice. Interestingly, a single, I Am Missing You, Krishna, Where Are You, was issued from the only marginally commercially successful album. With vocals from the prolific Lakshmi Shankar, the transcendental song speaks of the constant search of the devotee for connection with his eternal object of devotion. It was an idea that apparently Srila Prabhupada embraced enthusiastically, as ISKCON cinematographer Yadabar Das remembers. I was with Prabhupada in 1974 when George came to his room at Bhaktivedanta Manor. He had a tape he wanted to play Prabhupada. It was a song called I Am Missing You. Now, not many devotees have heard that. It's a very nice melody with nice words. Prabhupada really appreciated it. He said, yes, this is the proper mood, looking always for Krishna. He was tapping his foot as he listened. He and George had a very nice relationship. They'd be alone in Prabhupada's room together telling stories and laughing. Ravi Shankar's musical festival from India features the cream of that country's rich musical heritage, which includes many obscure but beautiful instruments such as the jal tarang, pakwaji, nakara, damaru, Akhtar, Santur, Sarangi, Veena, and Shanai. Here, however, the emphasis is more on India's musical culture than the strictly devotional first album. Still, there are various tracks in praise of Krishna, including Vandana and another called simply Bhajan. When I interviewed Harrison in 1983, I encouraged him to continue the series, but he only shook his head and commented that it was too difficult to get the record companies behind them, and thus, at least commercially, they were something of a waste of time. As recently as mid-March of 1996, Harrison apparently found new inspiration for working with the now 70-something master. It was announced that Harrison would soon be traveling to India to produce his mentor's last record. These days, George has forsaken most of the external signs of his interest in Krishnaism, but by no means should that lead anyone to believe that he is not intensely serious about the process of devotional yoga. As much as fame, fortune, and talent are a blessing, they're also a profound curse, leading him to associate with a lot of sleazy rock and rollers and other exclusively worldly-minded types. By the same token, however, many devotees are a little too orthodox and aggressive for Harrison, who by nature is a very relaxed and introspective person, all of which leaves him sitting precisely in the middle of two immensely different worlds. His wife apparently has little interest in these matters, although externally she espouses a passing allegiance to the tubby Guru Maharaji as well as New Age Christianity. Harrison's predicament, then, makes it difficult for his so-called bhakti creeper to flourish uninterrupted. Even his dear friend Ravi Shankar is now very old, physically frail, and otherwise preoccupied by his recent young bride. As a matter of fact, with the exception of Mukunda, who visits regularly, George is pretty much on his own as far as his inner life is concerned. So what then does the future hold for Harrison? Were he to follow the strictest dictates of Vaishnavism, he would gradually remove himself from all worldly affairs, including family, friends, and business, and eventually forsake everything to absorb himself fully in the fire of Krishna consciousness. This most radical form of devotion, called sannyas, requires absolutely no contact with one's previous associates, strict adherence to all the rules and regulations, and constant travel every 3 days to avoid attachment to any one place. By so doing, one quickly finishes one's business in this material world, extinguishes one's karma, and finally and forever travels back to the Godhead, where one enjoys eternity as an intimate associate of the Lord. Failing this, one is bound to return to this world yet again to further transverse the rocky and uncertain road of repeated birth and death, samsara. One wonders if George will ever eventually reach this highest level of his chosen path. If in the end, however, Harrison chooses to play out the remaining moments of his life as the grumbling laird of Friar Park, knocking around the place worrying about crabgrass and crumbling mortar, then so be it. Even if he totally turns his back on his glorious history as the world's first spiritually minded rock star, there is no loss. George Harrison, like all of us, will get as many new chances as necessary to finally embrace the shining ocean of truth that washes over the world, challenging, transforming, and purifying everything in its path, as it has always been.
And here's just a little bit about Dark Horse, the audio presentation that you are about to hear. This guy knows more about my life than I do. George Harrison about the author, 1983. Giuliano has written a revelatory biography of the elusive Harrison and his constellation of spiritual and secular interest, the Library Journal. Plenty to savor, even-handed, and soundly researched, Rolling Stone. This book is a must for anyone interested in the serious aspects of rock music, the London Times. A lively and sympathetic biography, Publishers Weekly. What actually makes Giuliano's opinion worth listening to is the depth of his knowledge and affection which he has for the Beatles, the Liverpool Daily Post. The least understood and most paradoxical of the Beatles, George Harrison has for many years resisted any attempts to penetrate the public enigma which cloaks the private man, that is, until Dark Horse. In the mid-1980s, Geoffrey Giuliano lived in the often wonderfully unreal world of Harrison and his friends, interviews with whom are the basis for much of this vivid and revealing portrait. Here is Harrison's Liverpool childhood, the forging of the Beatles, their unheralded ascension, and the bitter breakup. His solo career with its soaring successes and harrowing setbacks. His reincarnation as a traveling Wilbury. His impact as a record and film producer, as well as his often publicized and misjudged spiritual quest, as well as much, much more. This special audio edition includes an additional chapter which discusses Harrison's recent life throughout the 25th anniversary of the surviving Beatles. The result is a comprehensive, illuminating look at George Harrison's musical career and rich inner life.
Geoffrey Giuliano is the author of some 30 internationally best-selling books on the Beatles, John Lennon, and other iconic musicians of the 1960s. In 2006, his book, Paint It Black, The Murder of Brian Jones, was made into a film by Stephen Woolley and Nick Powell entitled Stoned, The Wild and Wicked World of Brian Jones. It remains a cult classic and the only film bio of the Rolling Stones. Giuliano is also a veteran journalist, having written for dozens of high-profile newspapers and magazines, including The Sunday People, The Daily Mail, The News of the World, The Mail on Sunday, Playgirl, and Rolling Stone. A noted film actor, Giuliano starred in such movies as Vikingdom, Scorpion King 3, Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, The Fifth Execution, Far Cry 3, Fire Fire Desire, among many. In addition, he hosted the long-running North American syndicated radio series, Geoffrey Giuliano's Roots of Rock, for 5 years, as well as pioneering the audiobook industry in the 1990s by authoring, narrating, and producing over 250 original, non-book-based, interview-driven productions. Giuliano's publishers included Random House, HarperCollins, Delta Entertainment, Durkin Hayes, Playaway Audio, Speechworks, and B&B Audio, among dozens more internationally. In 1998, Random House acquired his firm Tribute Audio, for which Giuliano acted as CEO and publisher for 5 years. His best-selling audiobook, That Fateful Night, True Stories of Titanic Survivors in Their Own Words, was nominated for a Grammy. In 2014, Geoffrey Giuliano founded Icon Editions and G2 Media Arts to market his updated works as well as publish new projects. As a visual artist, Geoffrey has been showing in galleries across America since 1977, garnering impressive reviews. His first professional assignment was designing several T-shirts for The Who's Pete Townsend in 1976. Geoffrey also designed and illustrated many of his original rock biographies for the biggest publishers in the world from 1984 to 2006, as well as designing for his pioneering record label, Samba Records, in the mid-1990s. From 2006 to 2011, Geoffrey was also the primary designer for the French fashion house Cotai. When Giuliano first conceived of creating his own literary imprint, Icon Editions, he became responsible for illustrating and designing 35 book covers, several hundred CDs, DVDs, as well as dozens of promotional posters, and eventually an entire collection of exclusive fashion and art. The expansive Design by Giuliano brand grew out of Geoffrey's impressive commitment to the arts and is the culmination of a lifetime's work by an extraordinarily talented and determined Renaissance man.